I've been a home renovations contractor here in the great state of Texas for coming up on 35 years now. And in that time, I've worked on some incredible homes and met some incredible people too. But I've also worked one or two jobs that have come to haunt me, and this is the story of one such job. In March of 1994, I got a call from a guy who'd just purchased a falling down home near Laredo Ranchettes, about 6 miles outside of Laredo. He said I'd need to stabilize the foundations, shore up the framing, and swap out any rotting beams or walls to align with state building codes. The roof needed reshingling, all the doors and windows would need resealing, and the whole place needed a massive utilities overhaul, including an HVAC replacement. Inside, I'd need to insulate the walls and attic, refinish the wooden floors, make sure all the bathroom fixtures were in good working order, and all after securing the right permits from the county courthouse. And all in all, it was looking like a 3 to 6 month job that had set the owner back between $50,000 and $100,000 or possibly more. And so as you can imagine, I accepted the contract pretty much there and then and signed it after 2 quick read-throughs to make sure everything was up to code. Now, I drove out to the place on a Monday morning, having signed the contract and received the keys on the Friday before. It was a big job, so I was pretty excited to get started, but when I arrived, I found out that my key didn't work. Now, I think I just rolled my eyes, then took out my phone to give him a call, but since it was pretty early in the morning, I was neither surprised nor annoyed when he didn't answer. I left a message on his voicemail asking him to call me back because he'd given me the wrong key. I wasn't rude about it, I just said it like it was, and how I'd appreciate if he could get me the real key as soon as humanly possible. Now, being there wasn't a complete waste of time because I could still survey the building's exterior and get a real feel for what I was dealing with. So for about the next half hour or so, that's what I did. Right up until a black SUV came tearing up the road behind me, and a guy dressed in a security uniform got out of it. He asked if I had permission to be on the land, so I explained who I was and why I was there. Now, once I explained I was the contractor, he softened up a little, but went on to explain how I couldn't be there just yet because the safety inspectors hadn't been around yet. Now, I thought I was doing the safety evaluation, but he went back to his truck to grab the paperwork for me. And then, since it all looked legitimate, with the name of the owner on there and everything, I got back in my truck and drove back into town. Now, I was having lunch by the time the client called me back, and while I figured it'd be a simple case of getting me the right key, it was anything but. He sounded annoyed when I picked up the phone and insisted that he had indeed given me the correct key. Now, I very calmly assured him that wasn't the case, but it was easily rectified, especially since he had a whole week before the safety inspectors could finish their work. Now, the client immediately says, "What safety inspectors?" And so I explained the whole encounter with the security guard that he'd hired. And once again, the client immediately responded with, "What security guard?" And this was when I realized something weird was going on. I told the client as much, and how from experience there was probably some kind of illegal activity occurring in his vacant property. He sighed, then asked if I could meet him out at the house the following morning with a locksmith and a sheriff's deputy. The next morning, I did the same thing as the first and arrived at the vacant house around 8 a.m. And then over the next 10 to 20 minutes, the client, the locksmith, and the deputy rolled up one by one. The client goes over the situation with the deputy and the locksmith, just making sure that they're up to speed about what he might be facing inside. Then, once that was all out of the way, the locksmith got the door open and the deputy led us inside. And the first thing that struck me was how clean the place was. It was still run down and I could see a bunch of junk and old dusty furniture in one of the rooms, but the hallway looked like it had been swept meticulously, as did one of 4 rooms on the ground floor. But when the deputy walked into that room, he saw something that had him calling it in on his radio just a few seconds later. It was a chair, a metal one, and it looked like it had been bolted to the floor. It wasn't alone either. There was a bunch of chains piled up in one corner, and the deputy mentioned that too when he made his dispatch call. It was obvious that something bad had been happening there. Something really bad by the looks of things. We just didn't understand the extent of it, not until we got upstairs and saw what had been done to the shower cubicle. Now, the bathtub was in one corner, and the shower was in the other, and much like the hallway and the room downstairs, it looked like someone had taken a great amount of care in cleaning the place down. But that's not what stopped me in my tracks. What had my mouth open in shock and horror was the fact that someone had reinforced the shower cubicle with concrete slabs, and these concrete slabs looked like they had bullet holes in them. Not all the way through bullet holes, but almost like damage where bullets had hit the concrete. And as soon as he saw that, the deputy told us that we better go back outside because the place was almost certainly now some kind of crime scene. We just did as he asked and walked back outside in silence, and with this chill in the air despite that Texas heat. We knew we'd just been someplace where folks had been hurt and then killed, and there was no telling just how many folks that had happened to either. And it all made sense why the place was so clean too, at least the rooms people were using for their business there, and why they'd most likely been scrubbed down during the previous 24 hours following my first visit to the place. Now there was a real sense of they were just here, which only added to how damned creepy it all was, and I'll never forget the look on that deputy's face either, like he'd never seen anything like that before. The poor guy figured he was going to chase out some squatters and ended up walking around a freaking torture and execution chamber. And as you can probably guess, renovations were delayed until the cops could comb the house over for any evidence. But they didn't find a lick of it inside those four walls, and they didn't find anything around the property either, especially digging the place up so much that it looked like the surface of the moon. Just craters everywhere. I obviously wasn't told crap by the cops, I was just the contractor, but when it came time for the job to start back up again, the client filled me in on what they told him. And like I said, the cops didn't find anything. But based on how clean the place was in relation to how run down the home was, it was likely the house had been occupied during my first visit. And when I tried to unlock the door, there had been torturers and murderers inside, and maybe even victims too. And that gave me a whole second helping of all that creepy, they were just here feeling. Only as you can imagine, it was way worse that time thinking that I'd been so close to such terrible evil, and it had been quietly lurking inside, while I'd been completely none the wiser. As a younger man, I was a Texas Ranger for the better part of 2 decades, and in that time, I saw and heard things that would quite literally haunt a man until he's lying in his grave. But out of all of those things, there's only one that haunts me more than most, and that creeps into my mind on those cold and lonely nights when I wonder if I ever really made a true difference. It was the early 80s, I was a much younger man, and I was essentially working as an understudy to a veteran ranger who had a heck of a lot of wisdom to impart to me. Then one day, we were asked to go visit a guy named Wolf, Paul Wolf, to ask him about his wife's ex-husband. A Mr. Billy Staton and his current partner had been missing for a few days, having apparently last been seen paying a visit to Mr. Wolf's house. Mr. Wolf was by that time married to Mr. Staton's ex-wife and had shared custody of Staton's daughter, Melody. He also didn't think her father treated her very well, most likely on account of his wife talking trash about him when he wasn't around. Wolf would sometimes become aggressive with Billy Staton whenever he showed up to pick up his daughter, sometimes very aggressive. And so Mr. Staton decided that he's going to slip a small tape recorder into his pocket prior to pickup so he can prove to a judge just how hostile Wolf really was. Now, when we arrived at Wolf's home, he claimed no knowledge of Staton's visit. He said Staton and his fiancée, a lady named Letitia Castro, hadn't been by in almost a week, and since they hadn't stopped by to exchange custody, they just kept hold of little Melanie until they decided to show. Now, we knew that wasn't the case, so we knew that we caught him in a lie, and that was all the grounds we needed to arrest him on suspicion of murder. And then, surprise, surprise, once he was in custody, Mr. Wolf changed his tune and admitted that Staton and Castro had stopped by his place. He started claiming that upon trying to remove his daughter from the property, Staton became forceful and started yelling at her. Wolf said he stepped in and tried to calm Staton down, but Staton began yelling and shoving him away. A fight broke out, but while Wolf was merely trying to restrain the angry Staton, Staton was straight up trying to murder him. Wolf said he tried, and he tried, yelling for his wife, Staton's ex, to call the cops, but Staten overpowered him and forced him to escalate. Wolf said that in order to save his own life, his wife's life, and the life of her daughter, he began striking Mr. Staten around the head with an iron bar. Now, he said he blacked out, like the red mist had descended on him, and then when he woke up, Mr. Staten and his fiancée were dead. Wolf said that in a panic, he threw the two bodies into the back of his truck and then drove out to a nearby river to dump them. He told us where the spot was, so we drove out to see if he was telling the truth. It turns out the bodies were exactly where he said they'd be, bloated and half-rotten from laying there in lukewarm river water. But I guess Wolf was counting on the bodies being too rotten to really analyze, because when we found them, Miss Castro's corpse showed that she'd been shot in the head at close range and was something of a large caliber. Now, this directly contradicted Wolf's story, as he insisted only the metal bar was used to defend himself and his family. But that wasn't the only thing that proved Wolf was lying, because when we dragged Billy Staten's body out of the water, we found something hidden on his person, a small tape recorder with a tape still inside it. And since restoring that kind of tech was way beyond our capabilities, we sent the tape over to the FBI lab in Washington to see if they could pull anything off of it. The tape was actually moldy at the time, and you'd think that we'd have dried it out and cleaned it off before sending it, but according to the folks over at the lab, drying it out was the worst thing that we could do to it. And we ended up mailing it to them in a little plastic jar of water, and then a couple of weeks later, they mailed us back a fully working copy of the original. And the audio wasn't exactly crystal clear, but it was clear enough to make out individual voices, as well as what they were saying, and what they were saying contradicted Paul Wolf's entire story. Now, right away, we could tell his story had been a bold-faced lie, almost right from the jump. It's possible to hear Mr. Staten asking his daughter to come with him, at which point she began to cry. Now, we figured this lined up with what Wolf had said about Staten being such a poor father that his daughter dreaded being in his company. But as she cried, he wasn't angry or aggressive with her. He merely attempted to calm and console what sounded like a tired and cranky kid. Yet as Mr. Staten tried to calm his daughter, it was Wolf who became aggressive, and then after what sounded like a brief struggle, a series of very deep thumps can be heard. The next you hear is that Mrs. Wolf, Billy Staten's ex, who begins yelling, "Get him! Hurry up and get him!" Mrs. Wolf then yells, "Hit him again," and then the front door. And that last part was in reference to the fact that Miss Castro was trying to escape. Somebody ran to block the door, and then Miss Castro's life was ended too. Mrs. Wolf then begins yelling, "Get him up! Get him out of here!" At which point Mr. Wolf enlisted the help of one Glenn Henderson, who later confessed to his part in disposing of the bodies and was sentenced to life in prison. Sometime later, apparently during the cleanup process, Paul Wolf can be heard saying, "Ah, damn it, Glenn, look at the mess you made." And we later found out that Mr. Henderson had failed to actually wrap one set of remains, and while lifting it up to carry it out of the house, a large amount of blood leaked onto the hallway carpet. And this ended up being a crucial piece of evidence even after the Wolves hired an industrial-grade vacuum cleaner to try and get rid of it, and we ended up putting both Paul Wolf and his wife away for a very long time. Now, during my time in the Rangers, I came to witness a lot of very disturbing crime scenes, but we get there when it's all over and the dust is settled. We occasionally watched pieces of security camera footage, and I understand that these days they come with sound and color, but back then, it was all black and white and grainy, and it ran like a silent movie. I realized that I'd seen a lot of dead people, and I'd seen quite a number receive fatal injuries. I just never heard anyone die before, so the sound Billy Staten made on the tell-all recording, that groan that he let out as his skull was being caved in, I think it might haunt me for the rest of my natural life. I was raised in West Texas, a trailer park by a single mom, and the rest is summed up by a couple of lines from a Merle Haggard song. "Dear old daddy, rest his soul, left my mom a heavy load. She tried so very hard to fill his shoes, working hours without rest, wanted me to have the best. She tried to raise me right, but I refused. People said my daddy was wild, and I guess I sprung from that same bad seed. But while my buddies were picking poisons like dope or booze or women, I got hooked on something altogether different: adrenaline. I was a junkie for it ever since I stood up to my middle school bully. He beat 7 shades of crap out of me, but I landed the sweetest right hook right on his fat face before he did, and afterwards, I felt so good I could have strut sitting down. He didn't bother me anymore after that, and I didn't see enough high school for anyone else to make the same mistake. But when I heard my little cousin was being hassled at high school, I just about jumped at the chance to trim some tail feathers, so to speak. And that, ladies and germs, was the first time I robbed anybody. My freshman cousin had a toy cap gun shaped like a pearl handle revolver, and it was his pride and joy, but I guess it was his own damn fault for taking a toy into high school because he got it snatched off of him almost right away. He kept his trap shut about it for weeks, so by the time I found out, there was no getting the cap gun back. But when I found the bully, I made him empty his pockets, I took his sneakers, and I even took the shirt off his damn back. And that was an even bigger rush than socking my bully in his fat, pudgy face. And I guess that was my career decider right there. The way other kids see a Marine in his dress blues or a roughneck manhandling his rig and think, damn, that's what I want to be when I grow up. I robbed that kid and I thought, hell, I could get used to this. And I started off in earnest when I was 16, stealing cars and robbing houses so I wouldn't have to get a real job. And then by the time I started hanging out in bars and meeting the right people, I got involved in much more organized sorts of crime. I started robbing trucks with a guy who called himself TJ because all we had to do was wait to see which truckers picked up a lot lizard and then raid their cargo when the cab was shaking. And that made us some good money for a while, but as we got older and started racking up bills, we needed to graduate to something a little more rewarding. We started robbing gas stations, bars, and pawn shops, anything that would net us a clean 4 or 5 figures if we hit the safe on deposit day. And then as we started hitting bigger and bigger places, we brought on a guy called Jody for crowd control. Now this was my crew for about 3 years, and we'd hit a place maybe once every couple of months if conditions were just right. But then for this one job of robbing a small credit union, Jody wasn't available, and after shopping around, TJ said that he'd found a replacement in the form of a guy named Vincent. Before we did anything with Vincent, I wanted a face-to-face, and so we met for some steak and potatoes over at this little place outside of Odessa. And TJ said that he was a big guy, pretty sharp too, meaning that he'd be the perfect replacement for Jody while he was out of state. And then when he walked through the door of that steak place, I couldn't have agreed more. The guy was terrifying, not just because of how big he was, and he had to be scraping at least 7 feet with his boots on, but because of the way he carried himself, like he was meaner than a skillet full of rattlesnakes. I'm not easy to frighten, but having Vincent sitting across from me with his long and wild-looking beard, it had me feeling like Dobby in a glue trap. He had this way of looking at you that felt like he was peeking right into your head, just sort of quietly figuring you out. Vincent said he had some military experience, just not with the U.S. military, and that he had connections in the Aryan nations after doing a little time over in New Mexico. He didn't have a problem working in a crew, and he didn't mind doing things our way if we organized the job right. And the only thing that struck me as sketchy was when he said that he couldn't talk about the time that he served in that other country's military. That kind of set off my bullcrap detector, but if all we needed him to do was stand there and look mean, then he'd be just fine. We ended up hitting this little credit union about a week later, and unlike a lot of the bigger unions or bank chains, the manager proved a tough nut to crack. A teller in a big bank chain is just there to collect a paycheck, but a small-town credit union manager, that's his whole life that you're stamping on. He knows his customers, they're his neighbors, and he likes them too. But what he doesn't like is no-account robbers like us thinking that we can have something for nothing. A small-town credit union manager might think twice, maybe even 3 times before handing over the keys or codes, and in a profession like mine, seconds meant safety. And the more you racked up during that crucial part of a job, the more danger of getting busted there was. And the one at the job that I'm talking about was no different. It was my job to get him to hand over the keys while TJ and Vincent watched the door and worked crowd control, and right away, just from the look in the manager's eyes, I knew that he wasn't going to play ball. I ended up bashing him over the head with my pistol a few times just to show that I was serious. I can't say that I'm altogether proud of that, but like I said, seconds mean safety. He took one hit, and then another, and he still didn't break. I was getting worried that he might not break at all until Vincent pointed at one of the two tellers working at the place and asked if she was the man's daughter. No, the manager was a lily-white Texan, while the teller looked like her parents came from Mexico or maybe further south. So when Vincent first suggested that she was the manager's daughter, I thought to myself, what are you smoking? But when I turned back to the manager, he had this look of pure terror in his eyes. Vincent smiled, jumped over the counter, and then started tearing at the buttons on the girl's blouse, saying that he was going to do all this obscene stuff to her right in front of her dad. The manager just about lost his mind and promised to hand over the keys if Vincent promised not to touch her. And that was all it took, and we were out of there with a whole bunch of cash just a few minutes later. I later asked Vincent if he was serious, if he really would have done all those things that he talked about to make the manager hand over the keys. Now he just smiled that big wolfish smile of his and said, "Whatever it takes to get the job done, brother. Whatever it takes." Now I had no doubt in my mind that he meant what he said, and I don't think I've ever met anyone who was so obviously a dyed-in-the-wool psycho. But little did I know, I hadn't seen nothing yet. The next job we did with Vincent, we hit up a little savings bank just outside of San Antonio. One of the Mexican supervisors, who we needed to open up the safety deposit boxes, had some kind of meltdown and forgot all of her English. Maybe she did it on purpose to slow us down, or maybe it was genuine, who knows. But what I do know is that out of nowhere, Vincent steps up and starts straight up speaking fluent Spanish to her. Now he's not just talking Spanish either, he's talking to this chick like he's her damned uncle or something, trying to almost soothe and relax her. And you know something? It worked. She freezes up, stops screeching like a whistle, and then just looks at him as he gives his little speech. And then when he's done, she hands over the keys to the boxes, and once again, we're making our getaway in minutes flat. We all wanted to know what he said to that lady, but Vincent calmly explained that all he did was tell her what would happen if she didn't hand over those keys. That San Antonio bank job was the last we saw of Vincent for a little while. He said he had some business out of state, but that he was working on something in the meantime, and he'd let us know if he could use our help. Now, we said we appreciated him keeping us in mind, but to be honest, we were more than happy to go our separate ways. Vincent got the job done all right, but at the same time, he felt like a liability, like it was only going to be a matter of time before he did something terrible. Like what he said he was fixing to do to that guy's daughter right there in front of him. And maybe 9 months later, TJ gets a call from Vincent about that job that he said he was casing. I was in TJ's place when he got the call, and the second he said, "Oh, hey Vincent, how's your mom and them?" I got to rolling my eyes thinking, "Ah, crap, here we go again." Now there came a point in the conversation when TJ started sounding a little skeptical, saying stuff like, "I don't know, Vincent, sounds like a lot." But then Vincent said something to him, something I didn't hear, which made him look like Jesus Christ himself had just talked down that phone to him. Now his eyes went very wide and his jaw dropped a little, and he stayed very quiet for a long time before setting up a meeting. And I remember driving out to the diner with TJ and trying to figure out what was going on. You know, he kept saying stuff like, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," or "You're better off hearing it from the horse's mouth." He also said if he told me what Vincent had in mind, I'd probably duck and roll out of the car, and that's when I asked him to at least tell me what kind of job they'd talked about. TJ kept his eyes on the road but told me, "The last one before we retire." And after that, it was my turn to stay quiet and just stew in the mystery until we got to the diner. And when we got there, Vincent was leaning over this big plate of steak and eggs, eating it like he hadn't in weeks. And we asked him where he'd been, and he tells us, Mexico. And then explains how he's been eyeing up the score of a goddamn lifetime, just like TJ said. He'd been tracking these cash couriers south of the border for weeks, casing their routes, figuring out their schedules, and then putting together enough firepower to make the job doable. I asked him what kind of firepower we needed, if all we wanted to do was scare a couple of couriers, but he said to do that, we needed something that'd pierce armor. The golden rule of armed robbery is to not kill anyone, because then you're a murderer and the cops will hunt you like one. We don't use armored piercing anything because the best jobs are the kind where bullets don't get fired, and so when Vincent mentioned armor piercing, my ass was halfway out the door. But then he started talking about how to get the couriers to stop, we needed to at least demonstrate that we could pierce the armor on their trucks, and without that, they'd just roll through the ambush without stopping and they'd get away. Now, I guess I had it in my head that this was a regular job, and when I say regular, I mean your standard armored car job. So when Vincent said that the couriers were carrying some cash illegally across the border and were doing it for the Sinaloa cartel, I thought he'd lost his damned mind. Now, I feel like just about everyone in America knows who the cartel are these days, but the Sinaloa stand tall even among their fellow narcos. They're one of the oldest in Mexico, and at the time, they were by far the most powerful, too. They were led by the El Chapo guy for a while, and they don't mess around when it comes to protecting their operations. And so when Vincent suggested we rob them, I figured it'd be quicker to just shoot each other in the face right there and then, because if we robbed the cartel, that's how we were going to end up, dead as buzzard bait. But Vincent said he had a plan. At the time, the Sinaloa cartel was at war with the Juarez cartel. Couriers were getting robbed and their hitmen were dying by the dozen, but it was all just one big mess down there. But that meant, at least according to Vincent, that the Sinaloa wouldn't suspect a foursome of gringos to be responsible for robbing one of the couriers, at least not unless directed by their enemies in Juarez. And to him, it was foolproof, and if we did the job right, we could bring home enough laundered cash to retire on. We wouldn't have to worry about washing it. We wouldn't have to worry about anyone coming after us. All we'd have to do is figure out what kind of porch swing we wanted to sit our asses down on until we were old enough to die, and figure out which kind of beer we wanted to drink while we were doing it. I didn't realize how much I wanted out until I saw the crack in the door, and I guess it was the same for TJ and Jody too, because after thinking on it for all of 30 seconds, we decided to go for it. About a week later, we all met up with Vincent just before midnight for the long-ass drive down to the ambush site. Vincent's plan was relatively simple. At dawn, when the couriers approached our position in their 2 trucks, we'd pull up a heavy chain across the dirt road, kill their engines with our armor-piercing bullets, and then keep on shooting until any guards were dead and the drivers surrendered. When I asked him how he was so sure the drivers would just surrender, Vincent said that they were just that, drivers. They'd give themselves up once they realized that they were in trouble. Now I started getting doubts, because if those drivers lost all that cash, the cartel weren't going to just slap them on the back and say, "Better luck next time, hombre." They'd torture those guys first just to make sure that they weren't in on the scam. And then even if they weren't, they'd carve them up and hang them from a bridge just to make an example out of them. And the more I thought about it, the more I got this bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. But even when that feeling got so intense I wanted to puke, I'd push it back down again and tell myself, get this right, and you're home free. No more jobs, no more Vincent, no more worrying about anything ever again. And it was that which kept my mouth shut during that drive across the border. It was still dark as we set up, tying the chain to a tree before covering it with a thin layer of dirt. We dug little holes too on a low rise near the road, with one a little closer than the others so whoever was in it could pull the chain up and block the couriers. And after that, it was just a case of waiting and watching and hoping those couriers didn't decide to rearrange their run at the last minute. Now we waited hours, watching the sun get higher and higher and feeling the air get warmer. Now Vincent said the trucks would roll by about an hour after dawn. But then 2 hours had gone by and there wasn't a truck to be seen, and I started to doubt that they were ever going to show up at all. Now by around 8 a.m. we were all sweating buckets, barely able to hear our own thoughts above all the noise that the cicadas were making. But then after maybe an hour of sweat and frustration, I remember seeing this glint of light on the horizon as 2 white trucks came into view. We started hooping and hollering a little, having sat in those dusty holes for so damn long, and Vincent told us to shut the hell up and be ready. Now as we watched the trucks getting closer and closer, TJ took hold of the chain, waiting for Vincent's signal to start yanking it up into the roadway. But when it came, and TJ forced those trucks to hard brake as it rose up, Vincent didn't aim for the engine blocks. He aimed right for the truck's tinted windows, and then unleashed hell. Someone in the second truck managed to get a few shots off, but Jody was ready with his AK, and it was pure chaos, but it was over in seconds. So quick that me and TJ didn't even get time to fire a shot, and then once the smoke had cleared and everything went quiet again except for the groans of the dying couriers, we made our move. As we ran towards the trucks, I remember TJ yelling about Vincent not having to shoot everyone. Vincent said what's done is done, and he should shut his mouth and get to work. TJ had only just unlocked the second truck's storage, and we were about to go rummaging around in the back when we suddenly heard the sound of a child crying. In a way that only a kid's cry can grab your attention like that, me and TJ ended up spinning around on the spot to see where the voices were coming from. I remember seeing Jody, wide-eyed, looking into the truck in front, and then seeing Vincent open up one of the back doors and start speaking in Spanish. TJ had a daughter who stayed with his mom, so realizing that there had been kids in that lead truck just about sent him off the handle. He marched over to where Vincent was speaking Spanish to them and asked what he was doing. Vincent said he was telling them to stay in the trucks because someone would be coming by to get them before long. TJ didn't like that one bit on account of we all know what happens to kids or dogs when they're locked in hot cars. Him and Vincent went at it for about a minute, going back and forth about how those kids needed to be safe, and Vincent thought about it for a moment and then said we could just drop them off at a gas station or something once we got back on American soil. TJ didn't much like that idea either, but just like the whole surrendering drivers thing, I don't think Vincent was ever really planning on doing what he said. Because as me and Jody are hauling a big bag of cash back towards the place we'd hidden our own truck, we heard 2 gunshots and then the sound of TJ screaming. We dropped the bag of cash where we were and then ran back to see what was going on. I thought TJ might have gotten himself shot, possibly by a courier who wasn't dead as we thought he was. But when we got to the top of that rise and we saw why TJ was still screaming at Vincent and calling him all the curse words under the sun, he'd taken those 2 Mexican kids out of the truck, and he'd shot them both in the head. Vincent was probably a head and shoulder taller than TJ and almost twice as heavy too. But after what he did, shooting those 2 kids, TJ went at him like a monster. Vincent had to point his pistol just to get him to back off, but TJ lost his vertical and was yelling, "Why? Why? What'd they do to you, huh? What'd they do?" And Vincent started saying how the cartel could be on our asses if they talked, but this was after telling us about the war between the cartels and how they'd never know it was us. I still don't know for sure if that was really all nonsense or if he just switched his plan up at the last minute, but those kids, man, they didn't have to die. Only one person had to die down at that dirt road in Mexico, and it sure as hell wasn't those kids. And when Vincent finished giving his little speech on how this was just too much money at stake to take any chances, he turned his back on TJ to go grab one of the bags. TJ then pulled his pistol and shot Vincent about 4 or 5 times in the back, and he hit the dirt, gasping for air. Then walked over to him. TJ put him down with 1 shot to the head. Me and Jody didn't freak out, not like we'd done when we saw those kids lying there with the dirt soaking up their brains. What TJ did felt natural, almost. No one questioned him. We just grabbed all the cash we could carry, loaded it into the truck, and then took off back towards the border. We didn't celebrate the money. We couldn't. Even when we got someplace safe and realized our shares tallied up to just under $1 million each, we were too exhausted to do anything but sit quietly with a few beers and wonder how the hell it all went so wrong. Those kids weren't like 12 or 13. They were small. Too small to even talk, I really think, and they wouldn't have been able to tell us 4 gringos apart from the boys in ZZ Top. So why'd Vincent kill them? I remember asking that question out loud, but TJ'd had enough, and after stomping out a cigarette, he told me it didn't matter, because that son of a bitch was dead. And then off he went to pack his share of the money. And once we were all packed up and we agreed to lay low for a while, Jody went to stay with his parents in Oklahoma while TJ took an extended vacation in New Orleans, and I went to stay with a girl that I'd been seeing for what amounted to a very low-key retirement party. I didn't tell her about Vincent or the kids, I just said I was done. Now, she'd always wanted me to walk the line and get a real job, so the news was music to my ears, and she told me to stay as long as I needed, and then maybe 3 weeks later, TJ showed up again driving a new Dodge. Now, it wasn't new, but we couldn't exactly go driving around in the same truck we used for the robbery, so it was a practical purchase. We went for a drive and caught up on things, and then TJ asked if I wanted to go get a burger or something later. I said sure, and we arranged for me to stop by his place around 7. Now, it felt like we were starting fresh. We wouldn't have to look over our shoulder anymore. Work wasn't a topic of conversation we'd ever really have to touch on again, and we'd had more money than we could ever spend without pissing it away. It felt like we could just stop surviving and start living, and it was strange to find myself grinning like a mule eating cockleburrs over nothing but a burger with an old buddy. He dropped me back off at my place, and then after a few hours of chilling with my girl, I drove over to TJ's place and knocked on the door. And that Dodge was parked in the driveway, but when I knocked on his door, there was no answer. It was almost exactly 7, and he wasn't the kind of guy to flake on plans like that, and so assuming he was probably just running late and was in the shower or something, I walked around to the yard and tried the back door. TJ never locked his back door, ever. He always left it open in case we needed a place to crash, and he also wasn't keeping his share of the money there either, so right away I knew something was off. I'd crashed there a bunch before, so I knew that there was a way to jimmy open a window or the first floor, but after getting it open and climbing inside, I felt my stomach drop. And that old cliche about the smell of blood, how it sort of hangs in the air, very heavy in places where a lot of it's been spilled, it's as true as steel, especially on a warm Texas evening. And the smell of blood in TJ's house was so strong I felt the shiver run up my spine as I realized something really, really bad had gone down. And as I ran through the house, I started yelling out his name and asking where he was. I found him in the upstairs bathroom, curled up in the tub, and he wasn't just dead. It looked like someone had tried to take him apart. I didn't look for long. I couldn't. But from what little I saw, he had his fingers missing, part of his face was gone, and someone had carved off a big patch of skin away from his side, so much so that I could see a couple of his ribs peeking through. That's the snapshot I can't ever get out of my head, even though I must have looked for no more than a second. I didn't stay long. I just slipped out the way I came in, ran back to my truck, and drove straight over to Jody's place to tell him what I'd found. Someone had come looking for us. We knew that much, and we agreed the best thing to do in the meantime was hide out someplace. Jody said he could find us a place in Oklahoma, somewhere real quiet and out of the way, but we still needed to square some stuff away at home first. We needed to get the money, and we warned folks who needed warning. Then, we could meet at a motel just outside of town and drive to Oklahoma from there. Now, it sounded like a smart enough plan. Have a base of operations just outside of town for a few hours, and then be gone by the evening. But after driving all over town and making sure my girl got herself to her mom's, I arrived at the motel to feel my stomach drop a second time. There were cops outside the room Jody said he'd be in, and police tape across the open door. There were EMTs too, and I didn't see them walking around, but their ambulance was there, and it was all I needed to see to know that they'd gotten Jody too. I left town right away, tail between my legs, but with the money sitting in the trunk of my car. I planned on going back. I still got family down in Texas, but once I got to Oklahoma and found a motel, I saw a news report on TV. It was about Jody, but it wasn't just hearing about his murder that scared me so bad. It was the description a witness had given the police, which became the basis for their person of interest appeal. But it was that which made me feel like the devil himself was standing right there next to me, laughing his ass off at a joke I didn't get. Because when the newscaster read out the man's description, being that of a tall, stocky man with long hair and a wild-looking beard, it sounded almost exactly like Vincent. Someone matching that description had been seen in the motel's parking lot acting strange. Then around the same time as the murders, this same person was said to have hopped in a truck and driven away from the scene at some very serious speed. But then, Vincent wasn't the only guy in Texas to have a long-ass beard and a ponytail, so that all could have been a coincidence, right? But then what are the chances of the same person sporting an oversized hat and a bunch of bandages around his head? I had never been so freaked out in my whole life, and I'd never been in a situation where I actually considered pinching myself because I was half convinced that I'd wake up to discover that the whole thing was just some horrible nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. It was real, and I found myself faced with a very real possibility that Vincent had somehow survived TJ's attempt to kill him and had come to get his revenge. Looking back on it, I realized that it was much more likely to be the cartel and that somehow they figured out a way to track us down. But just the thought of some half-dead Vincent walking around looking like he'd crawled out of a grave, it sent shivers up my spine even all these years later. I live someplace else now, just about as far from Texas as it's possible to get without having to learn another language. So let's just say that whatever people speak here, as sure as hell, ain't Spanish. My name's Charlene, and I'm from Austin here in Texas, and I think I got a story that you might be interested in. It's one I've followed for the past 34 years now, and as of September of last year, it might finally have come to an end. But don't just take it from me. You can come to your own conclusions as I tell you, from my own perspective, about the yogurt shop murders. So in December of 1991, I was working at a store with a little strip mall in North Austin, and I had to open up the store on a Saturday morning. We were just down the strip from a branch of I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, a place that I used to stop by sometimes whenever the heat got a little too much. Now, mornings were usually nice and quiet, even on a Saturday, but on that morning, I noticed a whole bunch of police standing outside the yogurt shop. I knew not to be nosy, but I couldn't help but ask if everything was all right, as smoky black stains suggested some kind of fire. One officer told me it was fine and that I should just go about my business. Now, he said it in a friendly voice, but a smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The police were still standing outside the yogurt shop when I clocked out and began making my way home. Only that time, there were men in shirts and ties standing with them, talking and taking notes. I caught a ride home with a friend, got to work on making dinner, and then later on while watching the evening news, I got a new report on what had happened at the yogurt shop, and I don't think that I'd ever been so horrified in my entire life. The newsreader described how, just the previous night, a fire had been reported at the yogurt shop. That didn't really come as a surprise, as I'd already seen the scorch marks and the soot. But the newsreader went on to say that after putting the fire out, firefighters were horrified to discover the naked, lifeless bodies of 4 young women. On the shop floor, a 15-year-old girl named Sarah Harbison lay dead on the tiles. Her body was joined by those of 17-year-old Eliza Thomas and Sarah's 17-year-old sister, Jennifer Harbison. All 3 had been shot in the head after being stripped and gagged with their own underwear. And then, thanks to the fire that had no doubt been started by their killer, each of the girls had extensive burns all over their bodies. In the back of the store, police found the body of a 13-year-old girl named Amy Ayers. Her burns weren't as bad as the other girls, but she'd been shot, execution style, same as the other girls. And the whole of Austin was shocked to its core by what had happened, and there were all kinds of tributes and vigils and whatnot so people could mourn the girls' passing and console their families. But once all that sadness was gone, once all the tears had been cried, it was replaced by this sense of anger and fury toward whoever had taken the girls' lives. It was so bad that a couple of days later, when some teenager was found carrying the same kind of gun as was used in the murders, everyone was convinced the cops had found the guilty party. I think 100 years prior, and they'd have broke into the county jail and lynched that poor kid. And I say poor kid because he was innocent of the murders and tried lying his way out of trouble because he was scared to catch a gun charge. But then once the police rolled him out as a suspect, there was this shared sense of frustration, like it was back to the drawing board, as it were. And we all hoped a new suspect would be found, and soon, but we had to wait years for any developments to this investigation, and when they arrived, it made no sense at all. When a new detective took over the case, he decided that the most likely suspects were actually the poor teenager I mentioned, along with 3 of his friends. You see, when they were first picked up, the cops were so convinced of their innocence that no record was made of what was said during their interviews, but that meant that this new lead detective wanted to interview them all over again. And the entirety of Austin was confused as hell because if these kids, who were by then in their 20s, had already been cleared, then why the heck were they being interviewed all over again? Now, we thought that it was some big waste of time and that the real killer was still out there, so imagine our shock when two of the boys, Rob Springsteen and Mike Scott, confessed to the murders during the second round of interviews. They went to trial and were convicted of capital murder, and both ended up receiving life in prison. We thought that was the end to the story, that those poor girls' killers had been found and that they were where they belonged. But then in 2008, we got another shocker when the Court of Appeals overturned both boys' convictions on account of improper procedure. It was a shocker, all right, but we still felt trapped in that same terrible spiral, if that makes sense, because the state announced that they were seeking a retrial. I felt like tearing my damned hair out when I heard the news, but then came the DNA announcement, because after all the analysis of all the samples, there was no evidence whatsoever that any of the four boys had anything to do with the yogurt shop murders. And after that, it was that same back to square one feeling, but it was much less hopeful. Almost 20 years had come and gone. The trails had no doubt gone cold, and many of my friends and neighbors were resigned to the fact that the killer would never be caught. And maybe about a year later, one of the original suspects ended up getting shot to death by police after a traffic stop went horribly wrong. Maurice Pierce, who didn't go to trial and wasn't sent to prison, ended up stabbing a police officer in the neck during a traffic stop. Another shocker, only a really nasty one that time. The officer almost died, and it got us all wondering if there had been some kind of mistake with the DNA testing. I mean, the guy tried to murder a cop by stabbing him in the neck, so even if he wasn't proven guilty, he sure as hell didn't seem innocent, you know? Now, we had to wait another 11 years for another development, by which time we'd next to given up on the yogurt shop killer ever being caught. And it made me sick to think that he was out there, walking free after doing such a terrible, evil thing. But then, in December of 2021, we got one heck of an early Christmas present when the yogurt shop case was once again reopened. Advanced DNA techniques were going to be used, meaning that even though so much time had passed, we were closer than ever to finding out who did it, because as I might have said, the cops had a DNA sample from someone they believed was the killer, and it was simply a case of finding a match. Now, even more resources were dedicated to the case in 2022 and 2023, which had us all praying that the murders would be solved once and for all. And then finally, in September of last year, so 2025, Austin police announced that they'd solved the case. After running DNA samples alongside the one from the yogurt shop, they realized that it was a near-perfect match for a man named Robert Brashers. Brashers was a serial killer who had been previously linked to the yogurt shop murders by DNA, and as early as 2018 if memory serves. But without the proper technology, police couldn't put it beyond reasonable doubt until just months ago. It was nice to finally know who was responsible, but it hurt knowing justice would never be truly served, as Brashers took his own life during a shootout with police in 1999. After getting the DNA results, police managed to get a hold of the gun that he used during that shootout. They test-fired it and then compared the bullet casing to one found at the yogurt shop crime scene, and it was an exact match. The news marked the end of a long, painful, and frightening story in the history of this town, one we could finally put to bed. But for some of us, who've been forever affected by what happened to those poor teenage girls, it's not over. And I recently read that under Texas law, if someone is imprisoned and later the conviction not only gets overturned, but the person is also declared innocent, they get up to $80,000 for each year they were wrongfully imprisoned. The article I read had a quote from lawyers of Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott. They said that they were hopeful that they'd receive the proper amount in restitution. But for me, it's that hope. That's all we can ever really hold on to. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over to my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear them on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, wear your fossil poop for Grandpa. Back in the early 2000s, I was looking for jobs and saw that there was an upcoming vacancy at the Sunflower Ranger Station way down in the Tonto National Forest. I was already a forest ranger at the time, stationed at the Gifford Pinchot up in Washington, but after spending almost 6 years there, I figured myself a little bit of a change of scenery. And after all that time up in the Pacific Northwest, the scenery didn't come much more different than Arizona. I had myself a solid federal resume too, with lots of experience in recreation, wildfire management, and wildlife work. And the only thing going against me was that I'd never worked that far south before. But lucky for me, someone down there saw it fit to give me a chance, and so I packed my truck and then drove down to report for duty. Tonto itself is an incredible place. It's situated in central Arizona, so in the south there's miles upon miles of gray-brown desert dotted with small prickly pears and taller saguaros. Classic Sonora stretches. And then in the north, the land rises up into the much greener highlands thanks to all the mesquite trees and juniper bushes. Then there's the Mazatza Wilds, where there are plenty of pines and oak trees, and where Sycamore Creek and the Salt River drainage carve deep-cut canyons through the rock. And that's where the Sunflower Ranger Station is, tucked on a flat along Sycamore Creek about 10 miles west of Pumpkin Center and a good ways south of Payson. Now at around 3,500 feet, you're in that transition zone, with steep ridges that'll make you earn every mile on patrol, but it's a solid base for covering the district. Close enough to the desert floor, but with the high country right out your back door. It's a very Depression-era setup, but it was still pretty solid when I was there. You had your main residence and office building right next to the barn, garage, shop that's got stalls, storage, and bays for the rigs. And then scattered around were a few newer sheds, a latrine, and a corral out back. And as for parking, there's a working area out front, as well as alongside the barn where the district trucks and engines pull in. Now, it's nothing paved or fancy like you'd see at the big stations, just gravel and dirt enough to turn around a trailer. And apart from when the fire guys are there in the summer, it's mostly pretty quiet up there and not some fancy visitor center. And so you can imagine my surprise one day when I walked out of the office and saw a hiker passing me on her way to the parking lot. Now, she looked to be about in her mid to late 20s, and after so long in the job, you get a feel for who's an experienced hiker and who's pretty much brand new to it. And from the tired, sick-of-it look on her face and all her fancy, brand new hiking gear, I could tell that she was relatively new to the hobby. I gave her a smile as she passed me, and then with a straight face, she told me something like, "You guys should really do something about the bugs around here." Now, I thought it was funny. The timing, the delivery, the absurdity of the idea that we could do something about hundreds of millions of flying and crawling insects, each of whom contributed in their own small way to the health of the local ecosystem, it was just funny to me. But I also made the mistake of thinking this lady was meaning to be funny, because after I laughed and said something like, "If only, right?" she didn't just fail to return my smile. She stopped dead on the path, turned around, and demanded, "What the hell is so funny?" It was one of those real uh-oh kind of moments. You know the kind. When you completely misjudged a situation in person and now some a-hole with a temper tantrum decides that they're going to make their problems your problems. But since I was in uniform, I could hardly tell her to go kick rocks, and so instead, I tried to calmly and politely explain myself. I apologized, saying that I totally mistook her comment as something humorous and that I wouldn't have laughed at all had I known that she was 100% very serious. Now, I remember she asked if I responded to every question in such a rude and condescending way, or if I only spoke to women like that. And then after I responded by assuring her that that wasn't the case, she once again demanded that we do something about the bugs. I took a breath, and then started very calmly explaining why we couldn't just kill all the bugs in the forest, because A, it's impossible to get them all, and B, doing so would upset what's actually a very delicate ecosystem. Now, say we did manage to wipe out just one of the many species there, you might not notice much at first, but the critters that feed on the bugs start coming up short at supper time. Their numbers can drop, or they can go looking somewhere else for food, which in turn upsets other ecosystems. And then you got the plants to think about. Some insects pollinate flowers or chew on leaves and keep certain plants from taking over. Remove it, and one plant species might spread like wildfire while another starts disappearing. The forest isn't some collection of separate parts, it's more like a net. And if you tug hard enough on one strand, the whole thing shifts. But I didn't even get to explain all of that before the lady cut me off. She started telling me how when she went on vacation to Mexico, the hotel staff sprayed down the grounds with insecticide that looked like a thick white fog. Now, I wasn't completely familiar with the technique at the time, but I knew that it was a thing, so I tried looping around to my last point to explain why we couldn't do that. At which point, she then says, "Can't or won't?" I tried telling her that I didn't know much about the whole fogging technique, but I guess the way that I said it was a little too dismissive for her, because she started accusing me of lying, and not just lying either. She used the term gaslighting. She raised her voice and said something along the lines of, "You just told me you knew what I was talking about, now you suddenly don't?" Then started yelling, "Don't gaslight me, mister. Don't you dare try to gaslight me." Now, I didn't even know what the term meant back then, and in the context, I assumed it was just slang for being disrespectful. Now, it was only later that I learned she was accusing me of trying to maliciously trick her. But regardless, as I tried to explain myself, she suddenly turned around and stormed off after giving me an exasperated huff. I kept on apologizing as I followed her towards the parking lot, but she only stopped once, and that was to get my name and badge number. Then once I told her, she turned and went towards the parking lot, as I all but begged her to give me a chance to explain. It's not unusual for people to have bad experiences with the outdoors, especially if they don't bring the actual footwear they need, or in this lady's case, enough bug spray, and I kind of pride myself on talking sense into people. I also didn't want her running off and writing up some big complaint to my boss when just a small amount of dialogue can fix all kinds of misunderstandings. But then right as we hit the parking lot and she made a beeline for her car, she turned her head and screamed, and I do mean screamed, "Stop following me!" Her scream was so shrill and sudden that it literally stopped me in my tracks. I couldn't even bring myself to say anything either. I just stood there watching her walk away thinking, what the heck just happened? But no sooner had that thought entered my head, a coworker of mine named Troy came rolling into the other end of the parking lot in his truck. Now, we saw the whole thing, so as I'm walking over to him, he gets out, walks around the other side, then gives me a nod of the head as if to ask, "The hell happened there?" Now, I walk over to him, so close that I could talk low enough so the lady wouldn't hear me, and then started telling him in words that were less than kind about the confrontation that I just had. Now, I told him what she said about the bugs, how it wasn't a joke, and how she freaked out after I tried to explain why I laughed. But while I'm doing this, I can hear the lady starting up her car and heading our way. I heard her wheels on the gravel, getting louder as she got closer. Then, as I was getting to the part about her yelling, "Don't follow me," Troy's gaze suddenly dropped away from me and yelled, "Look out!" I heard the lady's engine rev as I turned and saw it coming right towards me. Troy had warned me just in time to get out of the way, but even after throwing myself back so hard I tumbled to the ground, the lady's car only barely missed me and Troy before slamming into his truck with a loud crash. I scrambled away from it and got to my feet as the lady backed up, hearing Troy yelling out, "What the hell?" from the other side of his now damaged truck. Now, I thought that she might attempt another ramming maneuver, so I rushed to put the front end of Troy's truck between us. But instead of coming at me, she sped off towards the parking lot's exit with her bumper half hanging off, and then off she went down the dirt track which led to the highway. Now, seeing as he had the better view and wasn't trying to avoid getting squished, I assumed Troy got the lady's license plate number. And so when he said he didn't and that she took off too fast for him to read it with his eyesight as he was an older guy, I yelled something I won't repeat and then ran towards my truck and took off down the track after her. Now, she must have been going like a goddamn rally driver trying to make the distance that she had, but I managed to catch up with her just before she hit the highway, and I had her plate number memorized by the time she disappeared out of sight. It was a dang good job too, because taking a truck like mine on a high-speed chase is a big no-no on account of how dangerous it is. I drove back to the station, called it in the local sheriff's department, and then the lady was arrested that very same evening at home. Deputies charged her with assault on a federal officer, but while she was in custody, they initiated a 5150 and placed her under psychiatric supervision for 72 hours. Now, I guess she was so out of her mind that she hit the threshold to be detained, and while most folks are released after that 3-day period, doctors saw it fit to keep her under long-term care. Realizing that there was something seriously wrong with her and she wasn't just some a-hole, it made me feel almost the complete opposite about her. At first, I was nothing but angry and spiteful, and justifiably so. The lady tried to literally do me some serious harm. But after I found out that what happened was just the start of her hitting rock bottom with regards to her psychological state, I couldn't feel anything but sorry for her. Now sure, she should have been locked up for everyone's safety, her own included, but when I remember it these days, I go back to that initial exchange in my head and think about how I was saying one thing while she was hearing something completely different. No wonder she seemed frightened. I would be too, if I was insane. I've given almost 20 years of my life to the Forest Service. It's taken me all over the country, and I've enjoyed almost every single day of my service in a job that I considered myself lucky to have. But of all the places I've served, from California and Colorado to Washington and Montana, there's one place that sticks with me more than all the others, and that's the Deep Creek Ranger Station up in Idaho's Bitterroot National Forest. It's now called Magruder Ranger Station, but to me, it'll always be Deep Creek. But what makes it different, at least one of the reasons anyway, is how secluded it is. It's about 35 miles west of Darby, Montana, if you're familiar, and when you drive out there, out in the absolute middle of nowhere, it's like driving into a whole different country. All the trees are close in, the air starts getting that sharp, clean smell to it, and signs of civilization start getting fewer and further between. And then you keep on going for a couple of miles down some dirt tracks with barely any signage until it's just trees, trees, and trees for miles around, and that's where the station is. The ranger's house, a 2-story log place, was home base. You roll up after a long day on horseback or foot patrol, kick the mud off your boots, and know that aside from the one other ranger stationed with you, you are about as alone as it's possible to get out there. Now, it's been built in the 20s or 30s by FDR's Civilian Conservation Corps, and while it was rustic as they come, it had this real built-to-last sort of feel that made you feel safe. But living there almost meant embracing the quiet and being almost completely self-reliant. There was no corner store, no quick run to the doctor, and all our power and water came from generators and wild springs. Summers were nice, but winters were brutal, and sometimes we got snowed in so bad that we had to dig our way out. But that lifestyle has a charm to it, and after a while, you start feeling more at home out there than you do back in civilized society. And so I was out at Deep Creek for 3 stretches in the early 90s, 2 summers and 1 winter, and during my second summer, I was stationed with a fellow ranger named Gifford, or Giff for short. Now, me and Gifford made a great team. Same age, same kind of background and experience, and the same taste in music. And that was one of the things that kept the cabin fever from setting in too hard, being able to listen to all of our favorite guitar bands on what, at the time anyway, was a state-of-the-art cassette player. I guess music was one of those things that we just couldn't do without. But another thing I couldn't do without were cigarettes. You see, I've been a smoker since my teens, and while I've kicked the habit now, I was still very much a butthead back during that second summer at Deep Creek. I brought 3 whole cartons with me, one for each month that I'd be stationed there, and still, I was careful with how much I smoked because it meant driving a heck of a long way, and on back roads it was way too easy to get lost on. Now, I'd smoke 1 before breakfast, 1 after lunch, and then 1 right before sunset before me and Giff each hit the hay, and it became something of a little bit of a ritual for me. I'd sit at the camp table outside the cabin, light up a smoke, and then enjoy all that peace and quiet with no one or nothing to interrupt me. But then one night, something did interrupt me. A man, and one who looked like he was wearing all white. I was sitting there, just like I did every evening, only the sun hadn't quite set yet, so I was able to catch sight of him as he moved between the trees. Deep Creek might have been secluded, but it was still in a public national forest, so it wasn't entirely unusual to see someone out there. But as I said, what really caught my attention was their clothing. And all the time I've been a forest ranger, I've never seen anybody wearing white clothes out in the woods but them. Beige, maybe, but never a bright white. So as he walked between the trees, it might have been low-light conditions, he stood out like a sore thumb. Now, he didn't stop at first, just moved from tree to tree wearing what looked to be a white t-shirt and white shorts. If he had anything on his feet, they weren't white, and it also occurred to me that they didn't have a pack with them either. Now, it was strange enough of a sight that I just stood and walked parallel to them for a minute or two, just watching them, until he started watching me too. Now, I could tell it was a guy from the way he walked, but then he suddenly stopped walking and turned to face me. I stood there looking at him, and he stood there looking at me, and all the while I'm just thinking, just who the hell is that dressed like they're in a gospel choir? Now, when I finished my smoke and stubbed it out, the guy in white was still looking at me. And so, not being one to antagonize some stranger, I just turned and started walking back to the cabin. But not before looking over my shoulder and checking if he was still there. But that time, the man in white was nowhere to be seen. I told Giff about the guy before heading to bed, and he said that the guy sounded like some crazy kind of hippie, one who probably thought that I was a hallucination caused by whatever was in his brownies. Now, I thought that sounded about right, and then by the next morning, I'd just about forgotten the man in white and didn't think about that creepy dude again until Giff brought him up after patrol the next afternoon. Now, he spotted him apparently out in his truck, standing up on a ridge, and then when he got to the bottom of this winding road that took him down the mountain, this dude in white was standing near the bottom, right at the side of the road that he drove past. Now, this wasn't like an impossible feat or anything. He could have gotten down if he rode a tree down from the ridge and then ran down the hill as fast as he could. But that's just it. If he did run, he had to have run as fast as a freaking jackrabbit down that slope. And so, hippie or no hippie, both me and Gil found ourselves thinking, hell, that boy can move. And while it was strange, he hadn't done anything really threatening yet. But it was coming all right. We just didn't know it yet, and when it got there, it was bad. Me and Giff didn't see this guy in white again, not during the daytime anyway. And so we really did figure that he was just some hippie type who'd spent a few days out there wandering the woods and hugging trees. But then one night, We're sitting in the cabin after a long day of fire watching and trail maintenance when I decided to head out for my nightly smoke. I sat down, grabbed one of the pack, and lit it up, but I don't think that I was more than a few drags in before I heard that scream cutting through the darkness ahead of me. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, so after making very sure that the cigarette was out, I ran into the cabin to grab my rifle and then went running off through the trees in the direction that I heard the scream from. Giff was close behind me with a flashlight, and I remember it bobbing up and down ahead of me as each of us yelled out hello and who's out there and all of that. Now, it wasn't long before he heard a response. Someone yelling out for help close by. And after that, it was easy to close in on him, and I honestly expected to see that man in white in Giff's flashlight beam, having had a run-in with a pack of wolves or some mountain lion or something. But it wasn't him. It was some hiker wearing all the clothes that you might expect one to. He was lying on his back, screaming for us to help him, and I remember how pale he looked in the light. But it wasn't until we got close enough to see it that he started screaming, "My leg! My leg!" And for as long as I live, I'll never forget the feelings of shock and horror that I felt when I saw his leg was missing just below the knee. Although his pack was lying nearby, his severed leg was nowhere to be seen, but the amount of blood pumping out of the stump meant that simply wasn't a priority. The only thing that mattered in the moment was saving this guy's life. And so with Giff covering me with the rifle and flashlight, I tied my belt around the guy's leg as a sort of makeshift tourniquet, and then once I was sure that I'd stemmed the bleeding, I got him on his feet. Now, we kept asking him what happened, but all he said at first was, I don't know, before going back to begging us to help him. We promised we'd do everything we could, but that we had to get him moving, because assuming it was a predator of some kind that took his leg, we were all still in danger. I asked him that too, if it was wolves or a cougar, maybe even a bear, but all he said was, I don't know, and then begged us to bring his leg with us. Again, that just was not a priority. We had to get him back to the station and then call for help on the radio as quickly as possible, but the most important thing of all was not getting caught by whatever took this dude's leg. Now, I was the one who helped him move, so I couldn't look back to see if anything was following us. Giff could, and that was kind of his whole job, but every time I asked him if he saw anything, he just said no. We managed to get the wounded man back to the station. Then as Giff started working on him with the first aid kit, I jumped on the radio to call in a medical evac. Now, I knew that was the only real option available to us, so they had no real choice but to call in the chopper. And then call it in they did, and they showed up in those bright orange suits that they used to wear, running up the clearing with a stretcher and medical supplies. The paramedics treated him, and then they carried him back to the hospital after complimenting my tourniquet skills. But before they showed up, we had maybe 20 to 30 minutes with our amputee hiker, and while he didn't say all that much, what he did say had us scared as hell as the helicopter took off and flew away. Now, we didn't have much in the way of medical supplies at the station, but only in comparison to a hospital or some such. We still had enough to bandage the stump, apply an actual tourniquet, and even get some morphine in him to get him stabilized and a little more comfortable. Or at least as comfortable as a man can be after something just took his leg off. And then once we had him stabilized and able to talk a little more, we once again started asking him what happened out there. And again, he kept saying that he didn't know, but only in response of what it was that took his leg. He said he was just walking through the woods after a long day's hike, looking for a good place to set up camp, when he kind of lost track of time and had the sun go down on him. Now, he keeps walking, thinking that one perfect pitching spot was just right over the hill, when out of nowhere, he hears a rush of air next to him. He said it was loud, like something came at him really fast, and then a sudden force had him sprawled out on the ground like a freight train just appeared and smashed into him. The next thing he knew, he had this intense pain in his lower leg, and then when he looked at it, he saw it was missing below the knee. And that's when I heard his first scream and went rushing through the woods to try and find him. But in that time, while he was lying there screaming, He didn't see or hear anyone or anything moving around him. It was like whatever took his leg off just disappeared into the darkness again, and at lightning speed. It was the speed issue that later had us thinking about the guy in white. I can't imagine how or why he might have done something like that. It just seemed like too much of a coincidence that we saw this strange guy out in the woods, and then the next hiker passing through got his freaking leg taken off, and was such a clean and obviously man-made cut, too. We didn't ask him about any man in white, and I regretted not doing so for a while. But Giff convinced me that it wouldn't have mattered if I did. If the guy saw someone dressed like that, he would have said something. And if not to us, then to the cops who talked to him after the criminal investigation started. But he didn't say anything about him. It was only me and Giff who had encountered him, or maybe it's the case that only me and Giff saw him, and he hit the hiker so hard that he managed to disappear without being spotted again. And if, that is, you can believe a man wearing white clothes can just disappear like that, and under the light of an almost full moon, too. Like I said, Giff and I stayed awfully spooked for a while after we saved that hiker, and we didn't sleep until dawn, as we pretty much couldn't, and so we patrolled the perimeter of the station instead with our guns and flashlights at the ready. We didn't stray into those woods at all, and we'd have been fools to do something like that under the circumstances, but if someone was coming for us, we wanted to be ready for them when they got there, not lying in our beds, just dead to the world. And we never saw the guy in white again. Some sheriff's deputies came out to look for the guy's leg and ask us a few questions, but they didn't find anything, and we didn't hear back from anyone else about what happened to that poor hiker. Not from fellow law enforcement anyway, it was just really internet stuff. Nothing ever dramatic or terrifying ever happened again while I was stationed out there at Deep Creek, but that's what makes me think about it all the more and how strange and horrifying it all was, because if it happened once, it could sure as hell happen again to someone else. And if it does, I wonder if someone else will spot a strange figure walking through the woods just days before it happens. You can call me Ranger Mike, and I've been with Parks Canada for coming up on 8 years now. I grew up in Alberta and spent many a summer volunteering with trail crews in the mountains, and then after doing a park and rec program in college, along with working a few seasons at smaller provincial sites, then I got myself posted to Jasper National Park back in 2018, and working here has been pretty special. We do everything from guided tours to search and rescue, and we get to do it in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Now, it's hard work, long hours, but you never get tired of the views, and getting to call an entire provincial park the office is something that never gets old either. Every summer, and like a lot of places, the park runs a network of fire lookouts. We have a bunch of towers on the ridges and mountain tops, then as soon as fire season ramps up, we used to staff them with trained observers who'd live up there for a whole season. Now, a lot of the towers are completely automated these days and rely on a bunch of fancy sensors and whatnot. And if you're wondering, why spend millions of dollars on all of these top-of-the-line electronics that are also expensive to maintain when you can pay someone a few $1,000 for the season? The story I got here might well shed some light on that. Their job is a pretty simple one. Scan the horizon all day with binoculars and spotting scopes looking for smoke or flames, and then when they spot something suspicious, they radio it in right away with the exact location using maps and bearings. Now, that early warning gives crew time to get on the fire before it grows, and since lightning and dry weather can make it serious business here in the Rockies, the lookouts play an important role in protecting the park and all the animals that call it home. And probably the most famous of all the lookouts, though she came before my time, was a lady by the name of Stephanie Stewart. 70-year-old Steph was a legend around the park and had spent more than half of her 18-year career at the isolated Athabasca Lookout, which is up on the high ridge in the far northwest of Jasper. Only a single desolate road leads up from the valley floor, and if you follow it, it'll take you to the 40-foot high lookout and accompanying log cabin that stand near the peak. That might sound a little too much for a woman in her late 60s and eventually 70s, but to Steph, age was never an issue. Just a few years before her final lookout, she completed a solo bike ride across Canada and even flew over to Africa to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. She might have been a sweet old lady, but from what I heard, she was tough and she was reliable. And to me, that makes what happened to her all the more strange and all the more frightening. Whenever she was on duty, Steph's supervisor at the Natural Resources Group would call her each morning to make sure that she was okay. They'd talk shop, keep each other updated on the situation and resupply needs, and then the super would hang up and go about checking on the other lookouts stationed around the park. But on the morning of August 26th, way back in 2006, the first few calls from Steph's supervisor went unanswered, and when someone did answer the phone, they stayed quiet and then hung up. The supervisor tried again to get Steph on the phone, but that final call got that "We are unable to connect your call right now" message, like the phone had suddenly been disconnected. And as you can imagine, Steph's supervisor was very concerned by such a worrying turn of events, and so they drove out to the Athabasca lookout right away. Now, he found her truck parked outside, and then when he checked the cabin, he found a pot of water boiling on the stove, all signs that Stephanie was close by. But when he looked around, calling out her name as he went, he slowly realized that she wasn't there. And that's when he saw the blood. I've heard different things from different people regarding where the blood was. Some say it was on the stairs leading up to the lookout. Others say it was all over the porch. Some say both, and there was blood all over the place up there. But either way, it was enough for the super to call the Mounties, and after her super made the call, Steph was officially reported missing that same morning. I actually spoke to a search and rescue guy named Mark a while back, and it was him who turned me on to Steph's story in the first place. He was the guy who managed the initial search, and with the help of Steph's supervisor, he worked out that, along with a gold watch, a whole bunch of bedding had been taken from her cabin. Now, he said he took it personal, because where he lived, he could actually see the Athabasca lookout tower from his back porch, way up there on the mountain. He'd spent many a sunny afternoon looking up at that thing, sipping a beer and wondering who was up there, and so to think something bad had happened to them, like I said, he took it personally. And of all the rescue attempts he wished could have gone differently, he said that one topped his list. Once the Mounties were involved, they were able to quickly rule out any kind of animal attack based on forensics alone. The gold watch being missing was a dead giveaway that a person was to blame for what happened to her. And seeing as Steph made a call to her family that previous night, during which she'd sounded right as rain, it was safe to say whoever took her crept up on her during the night. But what I find particularly creepy is that detail about the boiling water. All that blood was spilled hours before Steph's super got there, and seeing as it was confirmed to be hers, it's unlikely she put that water onto that boil herself. This means the man who took her did it, and that he did God knows what to her and then put some water on a boil like he wanted to make himself some morning coffee. But when he heard Steph's super rolling up the track in his truck, he ran before he could be spotted. But that also means that he did something with Steph's body first, before he put that water to the boil. Either that, or he was strong enough to pick up her body and run real fast with it, and with Steph being 5'2" and pretty skinny, that's actually a very frightening, plausible possibility. Like I said, no one ever found Steph's body, so it wasn't clear if she had been killed there at the lookout or taken someplace for something even worse. There was a massive search effort, too. That Mark guy said it was the biggest that Jasper had ever seen, but apart from the blood around the cabin and lookout, not a single other trace of Steph was found around the forest. Mark said it was freaky, like Steph and her attacker had just straight up vanished, and there was a lot of people online who say all kinds of dumb things about Sasquatches and aliens and werewolves and all sorts of stuff. But there's other people, Mark and myself included, who think there's much more down-to-earth types of explanations, and his name is Travis Vader. Aside from sharing a name with a literal supervillain, Vader is a convicted murderer serving time for killing an elderly couple in British Columbia back in 2010. Vader killed them, but more importantly, he robbed them too. He also disposed of their bodies in a place that they'd never be found, refused to say where he put them, and no matter how hard the authorities try, they can't seem to find them. But not only that, Vader's alibi for Steph's murder places him within 30 minutes drive of that lookout, which most definitely places him quote-unquote in the area, and should have had him investigated as the case's #1 suspect. But then here's the thing, RCMP did nothing of the sort. Even after his conviction, when it became obvious that he was most likely the killer, they didn't question him, let alone declare him a person of interest. And to me, it almost feels like they know something they're not telling us. Instead of charging Vader, the cops had Parks Canada almost change their policies regarding access and training. First off, they blocked off public access to the road leading up to the lookout, and trespassers can now be prosecuted for straying onto government land. Then secondly, and in addition to a bunch of training, every lookout and cabin has been considerably upgraded. Each is now surrounded by lockable gates and fencing, and all the surrounding brush has been removed to improve visibility and makes it easier to spot anyone approaching. Windows and door locks have been improved too. Panic buttons have been installed at each location, and potential lookouts have to undergo mandatory self-defense training. And while everyone appreciated the massive safety upgrade, particularly Steph's daughter, who only wanted to make sure that it couldn't happen again, every so often I get to wondering what prompted that very expensive reaction. Now, was it really out of respect for such a dedicated and beloved member of the Parks team, or was it because of something else? To automate all those watchtowers and turn others into little forts, it's almost like the authorities know they're up against someone or something they can't protect people from. And although I've always appreciated Jasper for how beautiful it is, I know there are corners of it that aren't so beautiful. And no matter where we are out there or what we're doing, no one can ever truly be safe in a place as wild as this. I've been a U.S. Forest Ranger for 18 years now, and in that time, I feel as if I've not just seen the best and worst of nature, but the best and worst of humanity too. I've seen things so beautiful I wish I'd taken photographs of them, but I've also seen things that make me wish I could reach into my own mind and pluck out whatever piece of my brain is holding the memories of them. And unfortunately for you, this story is about the second kind, and one that does not have a happy ending. So what feels like a lifetime ago, I was stationed at the Wapiti Ranger Station in the Shoshone National Forest. It's actually kind of a special place, as not only is it the longest continually active ranger station in the state of Wyoming, but it's the oldest Forest Service ranger station in the entire United States. About 30 miles west of Cody, the original 1903 is now one of a cluster of more modern USFS buildings, all surrounded by a rail fence. And back in the summer of 2010, it was my home during a 3-month stay out there in the woods. We'd see a lot of hikers going past, either heading out or coming back from someplace, and sometimes they'd ask us questions about the surrounding trails or just the forest in general. And then one day, I stepped outside to see a young man and a woman walking through the open gate. After giving them a wave and asking if I could help them, the young man asked how to get to the one particular beauty spot about 2 miles from the station, and the second he said its name, I realized what was happening. See, this beauty spot was a very popular spot for marriage proposals, and we had at least 3 or 4 guys a season taking their girls up there for a beautiful backdrop when they popped the question. It was cute, I guess. They'd stop by the station to get directions, and you'd always see the excitement and nervousness in the young man's face while his girl remained blissfully ignorant. And it was no different on that day when I walked outside and had that young man ask where the beauty spot was. In the moments after, we shared a very knowing look. I knew what he was planning, and he could tell that I knew. And so after giving him a nod and a very wry smile, I addressed him with as much courtesy and respect as I could muster, Not just because it might boost his chances, but because I admired the balls of it. You see, my wife and I had the total opposite of a romantic proposal. We found out that she was pregnant, and she said, well, we better get married, I guess. And then that was that. 2 weeks later, we had a courthouse marriage. And so I really admired these kids for putting it all on the line like that. One couple even stopped by to thank us for giving them directions, but sadly, not on that day. Because after giving them directions and having the excited young man thank me and walk off with his girlfriend, they didn't come back. A couple of days later, I was sitting in the office building when I heard a knock on the door. And then, when I went to see who it was, I found a missing persons detective from the state police standing there. He had a picture to show me, and I recognized the girl in it right away because it was the same one who had been standing next to that young man in just blissful ignorance as he asked me directions to that beauty spot. The detective said that he managed to track down her last known location to this forest, and then, after asking if I'd seen her, I told him sure, and then walked him out to the beauty spot. Now, on the way, I told him all about how it was a popular spot for proposals and how it wouldn't surprise me if the couple were either camped out there or had eloped on some post-engagement honeymoon in a state of loved-up giddiness, I guess. Now, I remember laughing when I said that, and the detective kind of smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. No, they stayed cold, and what we saw next made me realize why they'd stayed that way. When we made it to the beauty spot, it looked like it always had. A small hill crested above a gentle slope which led down to a stream with a meadow full of wildflowers beyond it. It was just as pretty as I remembered it, and the detective agreed that it was a fine spot for a proposal. But then, we both looked down, and we saw them. Lying on the soft soil beneath us, one behind the other, were the two missing kids. The girl's head had been partially blown away by what must have been a point-blank shot, and while there was no obvious wounds to the male, it later came out that he'd bled out from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his own stomach. Now, the picture that emerged was a horrifying one, easily one of the most haunting, heart-wrenching things that I've ever had the misfortune of coming across as a forest ranger. Boy proposes to girl, having been sure as anything that she'd say yes. When she said no, he lost his mind for a moment and shot her. Maybe he didn't even say no. Maybe she said a whole lot of things before he pulled the trigger. But whatever it was, it probably wasn't yes. And so our young man, with his bright future ahead of him, chose to throw it all away over a moment of wounded pride. Now, we think he came to his senses after he watched his girl's dead body tumbling down the slope, and then knowing that he couldn't deal with the consequences of his own actions and wanting nothing more than to lie with his beloved during the final moments of his life, our would-be groom chose to end this on his own terms, the slow and painful way. Having seen him lying there like that, I don't think I'll ever stop being haunted by the look on his face. He died in agony, both physical and emotional, and it read all over his cold, lifeless face as we looked down at him. And then the image of a man cradling a much smaller woman whose skull you can see into because it had been torn open by a bullet. That sure as hell was something that I wish I could forget too. Now, I don't feel sorry for him. I think he got what he deserved in a strange sense, and it's the girl that I feel sorry for, the one who wasn't given any choice in the matter. She went out with him that day not knowing what was coming, what was really coming, I mean, and I found myself hoping to God that it was quick and that she didn't have to suffer too much or be scared for too long. Now, I don't work at Wapiti anymore, and I'm not stationed at Shoshone either, but a while back I called the station there and asked if anyone had been up to that beauty spot recently. The ranger I spoke to was familiar with what happened and told me that the last time he was up there, he'd found a bouquet of wildflowers someone had picked from the meadow and laid at the crest of the hill. I know the girl must have had family, probably friends too, and it was probably one of them who went to spend some time where she died and leave something to memorialize her with. But it was still nice to think that it wasn't just me that thought about her, and how incredibly unfair it all is that her life was just snatched away from her like that. Even though it's been 15 years now, I remember that day like it was yesterday. My name's Tom, by the way, and I've been a USFS Ranger up in the Pacific Northwest for the past 25 years. And while I've most definitely seen a lot of strange crap in my time, I never saw anything quite like this fella that I'm about to tell you about. So it was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the late summer of 2011, and I was at the station, feet up and sipping some coffee while going over some trail reports. It was hot outside too, so I had all the windows open ajar just to let in that sweet, cool air while hopefully keeping the bugs out. But then I heard it. The sound of a man yelling in the distance, and right away I knew that this was different. It wasn't like a celebratory woo or someone hollering for help. These were like primal animal sounds, like he was mad, but crazy mad, if that makes sense. Now, we're no different from regular law enforcement when it comes to enforcing the law and powers of arrest. So if someone out there is breaching the peace and posing a danger to either themselves or others, we're obligated to do something about it. So even though the sound alone was enough to give me chills, I grabbed my radio, sidearm, and a first aid kit, and then was out the door and moving steadily towards the sound of the shouts. Now, I didn't call it in right away because there was still a chance that it was just some drunk camper or a group of frat boys or something like that. But if it was anything bigger than I could handle, I had my portable right there. And thank God I brought it too, because I sure as heck ended up needing it. I moved through the underbrush that came up to about my knees as quiet as I could. The shouts kept coming, getting louder as I got closer. But as I closed in on him, I started hearing these wet thumping noises that right away struck my nerves on edge. I crept up over this little rise, staying low behind some bushes, and then suddenly, there he was, maybe 15 to 20 yards ahead of me in a small clearing. Now, the guy had his back to me, but he was completely buck naked, with pale skin all scratched up from the brush. And while kneeling at the base of a tree, he was bashing his head against the trunk over and over again. I guess I must have been frozen for a second because I remember just sort of watching him go at it as I felt myself getting sicker and sicker. But that's also how I heard him whispering something under his breath, and the only part that I heard fully was, "Got to get it out." We later found out the guy had choked down something like 15 grams of dried psilocybin, or magic mushrooms as they're called on the street, which constitutes what might be referred to as a catastrophic overdose, considering most people only chew up a gram or two. The guy was tripping so hard that he thought the fungus had gotten into his brain, and the only way to fix it was to crack his skull open and do brain surgery on himself, right there against a tree in the middle of nowhere. Something that I wasn't about to let happen, though. Now, I kept my pistol low at first, not wanting to antagonize him directly, and then announced myself as I broke into the clearing while imploring him to stop what he was doing. The guy just whipped around all crazy. Blood was smeared across his face, and for a second or two, he just stared at me with his chest heaving and the blood dripping off of his chin. And then, after letting out what was honestly a terrifying roar, he charges at me. Now, he came at me full tilt, leaned forward and ready to tackle me, but this poor son of a bitch was so dizzy from bashing his own head to pieces that he only made it about 10 feet before his legs just buckled. He went down hard, face planting into the dirt, and I was on him quick, dropping a knee into his back and struggling with him until his arms were pinned. Now, when the fight went out of him, he started mumbling stuff again, but he was too tired out and messed up for me to make any sense of it. I used these flex cuffs on him, which were pretty much zip ties once I was sure that I was able to, and then gave his facial wounds a look after rolling him over. And it was bad, really bad, and I knew that he needed urgent hospital treatment if he'd managed to do any damage to its brain. Now, I called it in on the radio before wrapping his head in some gauze, and then after that it was just a case of keeping him calm until backup showed up. And while we waited, I covered him with this space blanket from my pack as he seemed to sort of drift in and out of consciousness. And that's the one time he managed to say anything I understood, and even then, it was just a variation on the first thing when he asked me to help him get it out. I just nodded along and told him help was on the way. I didn't even know he was on mushrooms at that point either, so I just felt terrible for him. And when the ambulance crew showed up, they took one look at him before loading him up and taking him away, and the last I heard is that he spent a week or two in the hospital and then he was released without any further psych treatment. I went back to the station that evening, wrote up that report, and just sat there shaking my head. Forest Service work ain't all smoky bear hats and campfire talks. You deal with some really messed up stuff sometimes. And years later, I still think about him sometimes when I'm out on patrol. I guess some folks come out here chasing something, be it peace or adventure or escape. And I suppose not all of them find what they're looking for if we're going to get all philosophical about it. But that guy found it all right, and then he took it so close to the edge that he fell right off completely. And just as a side note, if you ever head into the forest, stick to the trails, tell somebody where you're going, and for God's sake, leave the hallucinogens at home. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. I moved to Los Angeles in 1998, met my girlfriend the following year, then by Y2K we were living in a small Silver Lake apartment together. We were very compatible, and where we weren't almost identical, our personal differences complemented each other in a way that made us work. But there was one thing we could not agree on, and that was my love of camping. I pitched tents everywhere from Joshua Tree to the Sierras, and it became especially important to me once I moved to the concrete jungle of LA. Getting away from the big city became doubly important just to decompress. I'd swap all the smog for cool, clean air, and then wake up to the sound of birds singing instead of traffic and the yelling of crazy homeless people. My girlfriend, on the other hand, was way more into luxury hotels and spa weekends, and the most she'd ever theoretically commit to in terms of camping was a tour of the West Coast in a camper van. And even then, she said that she'd have to really think about it so she could make sure that she had as many home comforts as possible on hand. And so, without outright coercing her, I started a weeks-long campaign to try and change her mind. I started showing her epic photos from my past trips, emphasizing things like stargazing and how the fresh air would be great for her. She's very much a health nut like that. I then started working the whole "it'll be romantic" angle, telling her how it'd be just me and her without anyone else for miles around, how we'd get to soak up all the good vibes nature was making while making s'mores with roasted marshmallows, her one true weakness. She'd always counter with something like, "What if a bunch of bugs crawl into the tent?" Or, "What if we pick the one day a year when it rains in LA?" And while I did kind of understand her concerns, it didn't stop me. I just so happened to pick the Reese Witherspoon movie Wild to watch while we were eating takeout. And then the next week it'd be Into the Wild. And you might be noticing a little theme here because she sure did. And then after maybe 2 months of slowly and gently convincing her, she agreed to a sort of compromise. No multi-day backpacking deep in the mountains, no eating of canned garbage and drinking creek water that tasted like chlorine pills. Instead, we go someplace a little closer to home, Runyon Canyon Park. Now, anyone who knows the park might be laughing right now because it's literally just a foothill in the middle of Hollywood, and if you look it up, you can see the Hollywood sign right there above you. It's surrounded by concrete on 3 sides, so it's probably like the least wild place I could possibly pick out. But seeing as it was so urban adjacent, low commitment, and easy to bail if she hated it, my girlfriend approved. I mean, maybe I'm talking the place down a little for the purposes of the story because some of the views that you get up there are absolutely fantastic. I mean, you can see all the way out to the ocean on a good day, and all of that after some very convenient parking. We could park on the street, pack light, and be on the trail quickly, and then after a day's hike we could set up our little tent and let the real fun begin. We headed out into the late afternoon to beat some of the crowds. Runyon is always popular with runners and off-leash dogs. And then starting from the bottom, we took a mix of trails from a solid loop until we hit the wooden steps up the east ridge toward Inspiration Point, where the views open up dramatically over Los Angeles. It wasn't brutal, but enough to get the blood pumping and earn that we're really outdoors feeling. And then by the time the sun was almost set and the city lights started twinkling below, it felt magical. We found a nice, somewhat tucked-away spot on a flatter section of ridge as dusk settled, and while we weren't quite allowed a roaring campfire thanks to the park's rules, we had a nice little setup with a portable lantern stepping in for ambience. The hike had worn us both out in the best of ways, and her complaining turned to laughter as we watched the sunset paint the sky. It wasn't deep backcountry solitude, but for Los Angeles, it delivered epic views, and she admitted it wasn't as scary as she thought. And before we climbed into our tent, I suggested that we hit up Big Sur on our next trip, to which she starts responding, saying, "Oh, easy, Tiger, let's see how I feel in the morning." But what neither of us knew at that moment was how neither of us was going to make it until morning. And so after crawling into the tent, we settled down on the sleeping mats that I'd brought along with me. She had the extra comfy one, I used my old one. And then after a little pillow talk, it was too warm to cuddle, we each went off to sleep. And then the next thing I know, I'm waking up to the gentle pitter-patter sound of water hitting the fabric of the tent. And my first thought was, holy crap, she was right. We picked the one night of the year when it rains in LA. But that was just the first of a couple of different thoughts, because the second one involved me realizing that it couldn't have been rain. The stream of fluid was too localized to the side of the tent and too loud to be anything but one solid stream coming from someplace. And that's when it hit me that some a-hole was literally pissing all over my damn tent. Now, I reacted much like anyone would and immediately shouted something loud and curse-filled while making a beeline for the zipper keeping the flap shut. I was furious, dude. I mean, I figured it was probably just a bunch of kids doing it as a prank after one of his buddies dared him to do it. But I was banking on being able to chase them off into the darkness and giving them a little scare for their troubles. But then, as I'm thrusting my feet into my shoes, I smell it. This sharp, acrid smell that smelled like something flammable. And then no sooner was I like, uh-oh, but woof. The side of our tent burst into flames from where someone either tossed a match or put a lighter to it and set all that flammable liquid on fire. My girlfriend was obviously awake by the time we saw the flames because I'd been shouting and moving around all angrily and insane, and so while I was still sitting there with my foot half in my shoe, it was her who grabbed the little pocket knife that she was keeping under her mat, blade open too, usually a big no-no, and started slashing at the wall of the tent to make a hole and make it fast. Each of us dived out of it, and I remember looking back expecting to see either total darkness or the last of the kids who set our tent on fire running into it. Instead, I saw maybe 4 or 5 guys, grown-ass men by the looks of things, and they weren't running either. They were just standing there, watching us as we spilled out of the slash in terror and confusion. I just shouted, "Run," but my girlfriend had already looked and was screaming as she ran for the trail. Now, I kind of lagged behind her a little, looking back and getting ready to fight when they started to chase us, but neither of them did anything but stand there silently, either watching the tent burn or watching us run from it. And somehow, I feel like that freaked me out just as much as if they did chase us. It kind of felt like they didn't need to, you know? Like they'd already set up a blocking force for us and we were running right into it. But thankfully, that was just the fear talking, and we ran and ran through the darkness without ever bumping into anyone, let alone anyone with bad intentions for us. Luckily, I had my car keys on a chain along with a couple of others, so we were able to get into my car and start the engine without issue. But when the headlights lit up the scene in front of us, and we could see that there was no one following us, and we kind of took it down a gear, and instead of driving off frantic, we took a second to just say, what the actual F just happened to us up there? We did drive off pretty soon after, on the off chance that they were following us somehow, and then we reported what had happened to the cops once we got back. But, and any LA natives were probably thinking this from the very beginning, but the detective we spoke to was not sympathetic to what we did. Now, he wasn't overly rude, but he basically asked us what the hell we were thinking trying to camp up on Runyon Canyon, because while it can be a pretty beautiful place and very charming to Midwest transplants like me, the park's just too damn close to the city to really be safe. He obviously felt bad that someone had tried to burn us alive, but he also said that we made his job pretty damn hard, seeing as there were tons of kids in that area who were capable of such a thing, not to mention all the crazies that walk up and down Hollywood Boulevard, which is pretty close by. Someone might have been drunk, bought a bunch of lighter fluid planning on burning the Hollywood sign, but then they saw our tent and figured, hey, beats hiking another 2 miles uphill. And it was that simple. It could have been just about anyone, and the chances of catching them were slim to none. Now, he didn't think that there was much to it, there being 4 of them or 5 of them, and them just watching us either, as he said that there might have been gangbangers, or we were in their favorite smoking spot, or literally anything. And in so many words, we made one hell of a mistake, and my girlfriend never let me hear the end of it. She never went camping again, which meant I only went like twice the whole time that we were together, and then the first thing I did when we broke up was head out on some week-long hiking trip out in the Sierras. It wasn't a bad breakup, and I never felt resentful or anything that she refused to try it again in any place, because ultimately I do kind of think it was my fault. I think I should have dropped the issue when she first said no and just gone someplace on my own that'd be safer, at least safer from people, that is. So I used to live for camping. It was honestly my entire personality. The second best feeling in the world to me was hauling my pack onto my back after counting the days, assembling gear, and poring over maps of the area I'd be heading to, just so I could familiarize myself with them in advance. And then the best feeling, on the other hand, was hitting that part of the woods where there was nothing but me, the trees, and all that quiet. It was my happy place, and I've been doing it since back when I was a kid, when my dad would drag us all up into the mountains every summer. I used to hate it when I was smaller, but then as I got older, I learned to appreciate it, and it snowballed from there until it was weekends, long weekends, even solo trips when nobody else would tag along. Now, my buddy Squirrel and I were like the main 2 dudes. If I planned a little trip, my friend named Squirrel was almost guaranteed to show up with his gear. Oh, and he's called Squirrel because picture a guy named Squirrel and that's what he looked like. No joke. Plus his name was actually Daryl, so it kind of rhymed actually, but anyways. Now way back when, Daryl and I headed up to the spot that we've been eyeing for months. It was kind of a tradition by that point because every spring for the past few years, we've been picking a tough trail, setting up camp in the backcountry, and then just unplugging from all the bullcrap of regular life for a couple of days. And then that year, after a solid hike of about 8 miles with some real elevation, we set up camp in a spot where the views were worth the blisters. We got there mid-afternoon and then set up the tent in a nice little clearing under these big old pine trees. The wind was picking up a little bit, but nothing crazy, and we figured it was just mountain weather doing its thing. We lit a campfire, cooked some dogs and cracked a couple of beers, and then talked about a whole bunch of nothing important until the sun went down and the stars came out. Even the breeze kind of worked after we climbed into our tent to get some rest, and after all that hiking and all that beer, I think I fell asleep the second my head hit the sleeping mat. But then, at around 2 in the morning, we woke up to the tent shaking like it was about to blow away. Now that must have picked up suddenly, and bad too, because it had gone from breeze to full-on gale force winds that were roaring through the pines like a freaking freight train. It woke me and Squirrel up quick, one then the other, and then we're yelling over the noise about whether we should pack up and move. Now camping under a whole bunch of trees isn't the best of ideas, especially if they're kind of isolated. They make for great cover, but also they attract lightning. But since we also couldn't think of anywhere close worth moving to, and since it didn't seem smart to go out into the pitch-black pouring rain, moving on seemed dumber than staying put. And so we zipped the tent tight and got ready to ride out. And then not even 10 minutes later, it happened. There was this loud crack, like a gunshot almost, and then this massive whoosh, and so fast I didn't even have time to scream. A huge branch, what they call widowmaker, came down right on top of the side of my tent. Now, widowmakers are the dead ones, just hanging up there waiting to drop when nature takes its course, or a strong enough wind comes along to do the job for it. And it hit like a ton of bricks, with the pain exploding in my left leg and hip the second it landed. Now I heard my own bones snap, dude. I didn't just feel it, I heard it happen. It also pinned me across my lower body, crushing my leg and smashing my pelvis. I couldn't even breathe right at first, let alone move. Squirrel asked if I was okay, and I responded no, in this really strained voice, and then he freaked out trying to get the branch off of me, but it wouldn't budge. The rain was still hammering down, and the wind was still screaming, and so every time a gust hit, and the trees around us groaned like they were about to come down, too. Now I was yelling in pain, telling Squirrel to stop because he was only making it worse. I saw the blood was soaking through my sleeping bag too, and even though I could feel my leg twisted all wrong underneath me, the blood scared me more than anything. I told Squirrel that he had to go get help. He didn't want to leave me at first, and I could see it in his face with my headlamp shining up at him, but he knew that he had no choice. We both did. We were miles from the trailhead. No cell service, nothing. It was either him or nothing. And so he grabbed his pack, left me his extra flashlight and some water, and then took off running down the trail in the storm. I watched his light bounce away through the thin canvas of the tent till it disappeared, and then I was all alone. Obviously, I pulled through, or I wouldn't be writing this, right? So there's really no point doing that whole thing of will he or won't he make it, because no prizes of anyone guessing that obviously I did. But I was up on that hill for around 8 to 9 hours, and they were the longest of my entire life. The pain was nonstop. Every single breath hurt like someone was grinding my bones. I tried to shift myself a little bit every so often, purely out of desperation, I guess. But that branch had me locked down solid, and any attempt to move only made the pain worse. I got soaking wet too as the rain kept on leaking through the ripped tent, so it wasn't long before I was soaked to the bone and very cold. I kept talking to myself out loud, stupid stuff like, "You're okay, buddy. Help's coming." But I wasn't okay. The fact help was coming was the only thing that kept my mind in one piece, because by far the worst part was the fear. Every gust of wind made those big pine trees creak and sway overhead. I kept staring up into the dark, waiting for another crack, another widowmaker to finish the job. I kept asking myself, what if the whole tree came down? What if Squirrel slipped and broke his ankle out there? What if he makes it but he can't find his way in the dark until it's too late for me? My life didn't so much flash before my eyes as my death did. I thought about my mom and dad, about my sister, about the guy at my job hearing about the way I died and thinking, poor dude. I thought about the autopsy they'd do, about my funeral. I tried not to, but I couldn't help it. I started singing songs in my head, counted stars when the clouds broke, prayed a little, even though I really am not one for church, but every time my mind went back to dying again. Time got weird too. Minutes felt like hours, and the only consolation I got was not feeling like I was about to pass out or go into shock. I think I lost a lot of blood, but the pain kept me awake, and that's how I knew I wasn't completely screwed, which, like I said, kept me sane. Finally, sometime after dawn broke, I heard voices. I yelled out as best I could, and then I saw lights coming through the trees. Squirrel had made it, having run those miles in the stormy dark like a man possessed. He brought a whole rescue crew, paramedics, forest rangers, S&R guys who had the gear to lift the branch. They worked carefully, talking me through what they were doing the whole time. And then when they finally moved the wood and got me on a stretcher, I almost passed out from the relief. There were all these new pains as stuff started to shift in my leg and hip, but the relief of feeling all that pressure taken away was, well, I've never felt anything quite like it before or since. They got me to the hospital, but thanks to the pain meds, the memories of it are all kind of blurred. I got surgery on my leg and they put pins in my pelvis. The doctors said I was lucky that my nerves were mostly intact and I wouldn't need an amputation, but luckily ain't the word that I'd use to describe the months of rehabilitation where I basically had to learn to walk all over again. I walk with a limp now and sometimes with a cane on bad days. I had to forget all about camping, at least serious camping anyway, and hiking, I can pretty much forget it. It took me a long time before I could lie in a tent without my chest getting tight, and even all these years later, I still have nightmares where I'm crushed by something, usually an elevator that gets smaller and smaller until I can't breathe, and then it falls like whoosh, just like that branch did. And life's different now, and by that I mean a lot slower. I garden a little, watch birds from the backyard. I'm grateful to still be here, but man, I miss those nights under the stars. That Widowmaker took more than my mobility that night. It took a piece of who I was. Sometimes I drive up to the old trailhead just to sit and look at the mountains. I don't get out, but the woods are still beautiful from a distance, and the fact that I'm still here to see them, that's something, right? Me and Squirrel are still good friends, but he doesn't much look like a squirrel anymore. He comes around sometimes and we'll sit on the porch, drink beer, and reminisce about old trips. I sold most of my gear, but I kept one tent. Maybe if I have kids someday, they can have it, and if they want to go camping with their Uncle Squirrel, because I know no matter what happens, Squirrel's got their backs, just like he did that day with mine. More than 3 decades ago, when my buddy Henry and I, who I call Hank, were still in high school, we got so bored one spring break that we decided to go camping out in South Texas brush country. If you drive southwest of Corpus Christi away from all the palm trees, white sandy beaches, and turquoise blue ocean, the land suddenly flattens out into this endless stretch of scrub. We call it the brush, I suppose on account of it being so dry and bristly, but it should be called the thorns because those are what you really got to look out for. They'll prick you something awful if you're not careful where you're doing it, and even if you are careful, one stray branch will catch your clothes and put a hole in your shirt. It's not even counting all the prickly pears, but at least they're kind of colorful, and then aside from those, you got your black brush, your mesquite, and huisache trees, and one of the stars of our story here, the guajillo shrubs. Now don't get excited, chili fans, it's not related. It's hot, dry, and dusty. It's real drought country, but while most of the time it's all sandy and beige and sad looking, you get one good rain and bam, wildflowers start popping up all over the place and it can look really pretty. And that's what it looked like when me and Hank went out to camp that day, since it had rained a few days previous, and thanks to the dry wash still being flooded, there was a gentle trickle of water into all the surrounding soil, meaning the brush was so green in places that the bushes were like thick walls that you could barely see through. And so there we were, walking on all that still, loamy soil after a full day's hike, and we're poking around looking for somewhere to set up camp. The sun was starting to dip, so the heat wasn't so bad anymore, and the air had that kind of fragrant green smell because of the rains. And then all of a sudden, as we're coming up to this big old guajillo bush, we start hearing this gentle buzzing sound floating through the air. It took me a second to figure out what it was, but as we got closer, I realized what it was long before I saw it. It was a beehive, but I couldn't figure out why it was so loud until I saw it. And I swear to Almighty God when I say this, but that thing was the size of a goddamn washing machine. No, I'd seen quite a few beehives by that age, and a couple of hornet nests too, but never one as gigantic as the one sitting in the crook of that guajillo. It was all gray and papery and loud too. I mean, obviously it's going to be louder if it's larger, but hearing that thing up close was freaky. Just that low hum from what must have been hundreds of bees crawling around in there, maybe thousands. We crept a little closer, not scared, just kind of awestruck by the sheer size of it. I mean, you know bees, right? You don't bother them, but sometimes they don't bother you. Wasps or hornets would have been a different story, and we would have been up and out of there faster than you can spit. But since it was just plain old honeybees, we stop and look for a second thinking, damn, would you look at that? And that would have saved us a whole lot of trouble if we had. And the first is that the guajillo's one of the bee's best friends out here in the brush, because it puts out those little blonde fuzzy flowers in early spring that the bees go crazy for. It's like prime rib for them down in these parts, so having their hive in a guajillo shrub is like having an apartment in a Buc-ee's, and looking back on it, it kind of makes sense how that thing was so big. But then the second thing I didn't know, and this is the real kicker, is that these were no ordinary bees, no sir. But unfortunately for us, there was no way of knowing until it was way too late. And so we stood there, looking at the beehive, having gotten as close as we could stomach. And then as we're looking at it, one of the bees kind of flies out and buzzes near my buddy for a second before zooming back to the hive. Now, we didn't see it for what it was, because we still thought that we were looking at regular bees. But by then, one by one, more and more of the little things came buzzing through the air towards us, like they were checking us out. No, I said, "Don't move a muscle, Hank. They're more scared of you than you are of them." But those little bastards were not scared of us, and they were about to go prove it in a big and bad way. The handful that came to check us out flew off, so both me and Hank were like, I dodged a bullet. But then suddenly, and it was like the whole entire hive kicked its buzzing up a gear, and we knew we'd pissed them off by being too close. We started backing up. Not too fast as to piss them off even more, but not too slow either, and you can be sure of that. But it did no good at all, and the last thing we saw before we turned tail and ran was this big black cloud of bees forming in the air as they came streaming out of the hive and straight towards us. Now, I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, running through the maze of brush as we tried to escape this coming swarm. But the bees didn't need to follow me. They could fly over and through stuff that I had to go around, so even though I was going fast as anything, it wasn't before I started to feel a few stingers around my neck and shoulders. I screamed, swatting at the pain as I ran, but it did no good, and almost all of the bees that caught up with me managed to stick their stingers someplace, either in the back of my neck or my shoulder where my vest didn't cover. And if you think I was getting it bad, you should have seen poor Hank. I was always the fastest out of the two of us, being taller and skinnier and such, so by the time the buzz behind me started to peter out and I actually dared to look back for Hank, he was some way behind me already, and he was getting absolutely mobbed. He was swatting at the bees as he was running, but even that just gave them more to sting. He wasn't particularly graceful either, so every time he's waving his arms around, it's throwing him off balance and slowing him down. He was getting eaten up back there. Like, I genuinely think the bees were coming for me, but suddenly realizing that he was the easier target, and flew all the way back to kamikaze into him in one final screw you before they died. Now I was yelling, "Come on, Hank, run! Stop trying to hit him and just run!" But it was like the more they stung him, the slower he got. I ended up snapping a branch off a smaller mesquite tree, one that had a nice flash of green on the end, and then running back to try and swat away some of the bees that were chasing him. I ended up getting a couple of more stings, but it was worth it just to not to have to watch my buddy getting stung half to death while doing nothing about it. And when I say half to death, I mean half to death. He didn't actually look all that bad at first, because I guess there hadn't been enough time for all the stings to kick into his system yet. And so the first thing that caught my attention were all the stingers still stuck in his neck and arms and the back of his legs. Some had even flown up his shorts too, and while they hadn't inflicted any direct hits on the old meat, he had stingers stuck in his thighs as well as every other place. He was in a heck of a lot of pain, and he swatted them off of himself, but he couldn't walk, and he wanted out of there. And so off we went. But then, as we're walking, the swelling started. I mean, it wasn't funny at the time, and it's still not very funny thinking about it today, but Hank later joked about how he looked like some balloon animal. It was one of those dark humor type deals that didn't get so much as a laugh as the damn type reaction, but at the same time, I think that might be one of the most accurate descriptions possible. Hank went from looking regular to looking like he was made entirely of a red balloon animal, and he did so in the space of about 5 minutes. His face and eyelids swelled up into these tiny little slits, so bad he could barely see, and then his skin turned as red as a beet, but with these tiny little white stinger marks interspersed and welts popping up everywhere that he'd been stung. I remember being on the verge of telling him how bad it looked. Not to rub it in or anything, more to say almost like, I think we're going to need a priest if we don't get you to a freaking hospital soon. But Hank didn't need telling. He knew. He started to pant as we walked, making these wheezing sounds as his throat started to close over. He kept saying how bad it burned, too, how it felt like his whole body was on fire and how he needed Jesus to help him. And that last part was more of a reflexive thing, saying, Lord help me, Jesus help me. But I've never heard Hank talk like that before, like he had one of God's hands on him already, and it was scaring me. Not just because of how bad it looked and sounded, but because we had miles upon miles of thick South Texas brush between us and the nearest stretch of road. And I didn't know how much longer Hank had in him before he just keeled over and couldn't walk anymore. Not even a mile into the journey, Hank started limping real bad where one leg was getting stiff from all the bee venom that he had running through his veins. He was grunting with every step, cussing under his breath as he stumbled into thorns. Sweat was practically pouring off of him too, with those big beads of it running down his neck and forehead. Now I asked him if he needed a rest, so he'd have the energy to keep going, but Hank said that he wanted to keep moving, that he needed that hospital and he needed it bad. But then, after about another mile, he started to get faint. His knees buckled at one point and he almost went face first into a prickly pear, and I caught him under the arm and held him up, telling him to stay with me. But then, the vomiting started. Hank doubled over after pulling his arm away from me, and then he heaved until nothing came out. I thought he was done because he kinda got up on one knee, but then the heaving started all over again, very dry this time. That was when I was most scared he was going to die, right there under that cat claw. They call them wait a minute bushes too because they give a nice patch of shade, but we didn't have a minute. We kept on going, but Hank's breathing got shallower and he started shaking like a leaf while almost dragging that stiff leg of his behind him. We'd walk 20 yards, stop so he could puke or lean on some tree, and then push on again. Now, I kept telling him that he didn't have much further to go, even though I knew it was a lie. And I said just about anything and everything to keep him going, to keep his mind focused too, anything so he wouldn't just straight keel over and pass out. I had to support him the last part of the way, and that felt like it went on forever. But after all that heat and dust and those goddamn thorns, with Jake getting weaker by the minute, we finally broke through the brush and spotted the highway ahead of us. Since I figured it was safe to let Hank lay down, I tried telling him that he could stop and finally rest some, but he didn't need to be told. He went down like some sack of potatoes the second he realized that it was asphalt ahead of him and not just some more scrub. And then I ran in the middle of that road and started waving at any approaching truck. This old boy in a diesel dually slammed on the brakes, took one look at Hank, then jumped out to help me get him into the back seat. After that, we hauled ass back towards Corpus Christi, calling 911 on the way while Hank was just slumped in the back seat. And by the time they wheeled him into the ER, I was convinced I was never going to talk to my friend again. But the doctors knew just what to do for all that bee venom that he had in him, and while I couldn't even begin to tell you what it was, it sure as hell worked. Hank spent a couple of days in the hospital with doctors keeping him monitored while all the swelling went down, but he pulled through. In fact, we knew pretty quickly that he would, because the doctors told a gathering of me and his family that we'd gotten him to the hospital pretty much just in time, and they could get to treating him before all that bee venom started damaging his liver or kidneys. I don't think I was listening all that hard after hearing that Hank was going to be fine. I was too relieved to do anything but fall back on a chair with my head in my hands while holding back tears of relief. I had to doubly hold them back when Hank's mom started hugging me and saying that I saved her son's life. I don't know if I agree with that, but she sure made it seem that way at the time, and even Hank's dad was rolling a few silent tears at the news that his son was going to pull through. In the end, the only question that was left was, why the heck did those bees act so aggressive? And to that question, there was a very clear answer. Like I said, those bees were no ordinary bees, and a lot of y'all are probably going to be hooting and hollering at this saying, I knew it, but we were told they were called what's Africanized honeybees, or more commonly known to you as killer bees. And the whole story of them goes something like this. Back in the 50s, Brazil had the bright idea of crossbreeding their native honeybees with African honeybees, with the goal being to up the amount of honey they were making. This did the trick all right, but it also meant the hybrid bees were extra aggressive. Like so aggressive that they killed a bunch of people just from the sheer number of times they'd sting someone. The Brazilians tried to contain these killer bees, but they broke out sometime in the 70s, I think, and they slowly but surely made their way up through Central America and Mexico, and then up into the southern United States for me and Hank to stumble across one day. It was a big story at the time, and it was wild thinking that me and him had been a part of it in some really small way. We stayed friends for years afterwards until he moved away on some scholarship, and he never got much faster, but he did get way bigger, and not in a bad way. We never did go camping again. Hank swore it off completely, and then after he moved away, we kind of lost touch. It's sad, but such is the way of the world, I suppose. But I know he won't ever have forgotten about that evening that we spent out in the brush, and how nature was really quick to remind me of who's really in charge out there. So it was early June of 2003 here in West Virginia, and my buddies and I had just graduated college, and we'd been planning a post-grad camping trip for months that I was really looking forward to. There was me and my 3 buddies, Bobby, Mike, and Josh, and since we'd been camping together before, we figured a few nights out in the woods wouldn't be a problem. We packed up Mike's brother's old pickup with some tents, a cooler full of meats, and some beer that we had talked him into buying us, and then drove out to the spot in the hills that Bobby swore was perfect. And he was right, too. It was quiet, pretty, and right next to a creek. It was the kind of scene that looked like it could have been on a postcard, really. But looks, as they say, can be deceiving. We got there late afternoon after a real sweaty hike and found that creek sparkling like it was ice-cold liquid crystal. We set up camp really quick, got ourselves a fire going, and then set up a grill that we'd brought with us so that we could cook up some burgers while we drank our beers. Now, by the time the sun started dropping, we were feeling pretty good. One of those nights that makes you forget about all your worldly cares. But I was wiped, like dead on my feet, tired. I pulled extra shifts all week, and the hike up into the hills just finished me off. And so when the boys decided to head down to the creek to take a little bath before we turned in for the night, I just waved it off. They called me a lightweight and laughed, and then took off down the little path towards the creek. I could hear them yelling and carrying on like kids, and it sounded like they were having a blast. But I just leaned back into my camp chair, cracked another beer, and watched the fire as the woods got darker. After a bit, the guys came back, dripping wet and grinning, and we threw some wood on the fire and settled in for the usual campfire talk. You know, things like old stories, dumb mistakes, who was dating who, and everything was great. The vibes were good, but then Mike started acting off. At around 10, he stood up and just rubbed his stomach and said he felt kind of sick. Now, he looked pale in my flashlight beam and said something about probably eating too fast before he headed into his tent and saying he needed to lie down. And Bobby was next. He kept scratching his arms and neck, saying how the skeeters must have eaten him alive down at the creek. He tossed another log on the fire so the smoke would keep them away, and since the woods are always full of bugs, none of us thought much of it. Josh was the only one where I thought something was obviously wrong. Not just too much beer or being skeeter bait, but legitimately having some sort of medical thing. Something about his face looked weird. A little puffy, like he'd been stung or something. When I asked him, though, he just shrugged and suggested that he was a little allergic to something. He felt fine, so he wasn't worried. Now, he kept talking for another half hour, but by that point, the energy was dying down. Josh crawled into his tent and I stayed up a little longer staring at the coals, and then finally laid down on my sleeping bag to catch some Z's. Now that night I slept like a baby. No tossing or turning, no dreams I can remember. I was just completely exhausted. And so all I really remember is lying there listening to the crickets and then waking up to the sound of someone vomiting. And hard too, like they were trying to puke their guts up. Now I sat up fast, head still kind of foggy as I unzipped the tent. And then what I saw made my stomach drop. Mike was on his knees by a tree, making all the puking sounds that I'd heard, while Bobby was sitting groaning against a log with his arms and face covered in ugly red blotches. Josh, on the other hand, he looked the worst. His eyes were almost swollen shut, and his cheeks and forehead were puffy and red, and it sounded like he was having trouble breathing, too. It looked like they were all dying, and painfully, too, the kind that makes tough teenage boys whimper for their moms. Now, I asked them what the hell happened, but no one really said much. Mike was puking too hard. Bobby was scratching himself, talking about how it burned and itched all at once. And then there was Josh, wheezing while talking about not being able to see. And all three were just begging for my help. And the first thing I thought to do was grab water. Stuff for Mike and Bobby to drink, and stuff to maybe pour over Josh's face, because hopefully cooling it off might have helped with the swelling or something. But they didn't need water. They needed immediate medical attention, and the pressure of it being down to me was probably the single worst feeling of my entire life. Nobody thinks they're going to be the hero in the moment, I guess. You just do what you gotta do. But all I remember thinking as I ran for the trail was like, they're going to die, and I'm gonna end up an alcoholic wondering if I could have saved my friends. But I guess the terror of that thought spurred me on and did almost the opposite of me panicking, because after that, I was just an absolute machine. Our phones obviously had zero signal out here, so the first thing that I did was grab the map from Bobby's bag and look for the nearest ranger station. When I spotted one 4 miles down the road, I took a second to check my bearings and then took off running like a crazy person. I'd never run like that before in my whole life, and the only sport that I played was backyard football, so while 4 miles didn't sound all that far on paper, in practice, it was complete hell on wheels. My legs started to feel like lead. I puked, had to slow down before I passed out, all of that. But I never stopped. I never once stopped still. And those 3 miles felt like it could have been 300, and I lost count of the number of times I tripped and almost fell. But when I finally burst through those trees and saw the ranger station, I almost cried with joy and relief. After I banged on the door as hard as I could, the ranger on duty, a guy named Daryl, came to the door angry as hell, asking what all the fuss was about. He took one look at me and got serious real quick. I told him everything about my buddies and the weird symptoms they had, and he relayed all directly to county dispatch. Now, within maybe 20 minutes of my arriving there, a couple of ATVs showed up with paramedics, and we raced back to where we were camped. When we got there, the guys were in even worse shape, but the medics moved fast. They had IVs, oxygen, and other stuff all ready to go, and then after wrapping them up and loading them onto the ATVs, they disappeared off down the trail. They airlifted them from a clearing near the station, while me and Daryl followed in the ranger's truck all the way to the hospital in the nearest town. The whole drive, they kept asking questions about what we did, what we touched, and when I mentioned the creek, his face got tight, and then he said how they'd had problems up there a couple of times before. I asked him what kind of problems, but he said it was best to wait for whatever the doctor said. At the hospital, I sat in the waiting room covered in dirt and sweat, feeling useless for hours and hours, until finally a doctor came out and explained what had happened. It was chemical burns, severe poisoning from something dumped in the creek that the boys had washed in. He said that there were probably industrial solvents, all kinds of heavy metals, and God knows what else. We later found out someone had been illegally dumping waste upstream, probably for about a year for the water to get that bad. The water looked fine, but it was poison, and my friends had done just about everything but go swimming right in it. They'd splashed around it, drank a bunch, and then let it get in their eyes, and that's why it hit them so hard, while I was completely unaffected. All 3 of my friends pulled through, thank God, but not without side effects. Mike still gets stomach issues sometimes when he eats certain things. Bobby won't even use bug spray anymore because the smell reminds him. And these days, Josh wears sunglasses when the sun's too bright for him. The cops and environmental people get involved. It turns out it was some shady company cutting corners, paying off truckers to dump barrels into the woods. They got caught eventually, but that didn't fix what happened to us, and we never went camping again, and never even discussed it. The four of us still hang out, but now it's just barbecues in somebody's backyard or catching a game at a bar. And even today, every time I see a creek or a lake, I get this certain feeling in my chest. We set up camp right next to the whole creek full of liquid death and didn't even know it, while the decision to stay by the fire might well have saved my life. We survived, but man, we sure as hell learned our lesson. Be careful with water sources when you're out in the trails, especially when it comes to drinking stuff, because no matter how nice and clean it looks, you never really know what's in there, not until it's too late. So it came out of nowhere. One minute we were laughing around the fire, swapping dumb stories and roasting marshmallows. Then the next minute, it all came smashing down on us like some kind of apocalyptic event. We planned the trip for weeks, thinking some camping out on the flats would be fun. It was me, my buddy Scott, his girlfriend Sarah, and her cousin Ryan. We hiked on the Friday afternoon, found a sweet spot by the river, and set up camp before the sun dropped. We had some dogs, marshmallows, and graham crackers, the whole ordeal. Now, Scott kept saying that it was the best trip ever, but looking back on it, those feel like famous last words. Saturday started just fine. We fished a little, hiked a little, and then were back at camp by early evening. We had a fire roaring, music playing low on the portable speaker, and then off in the distance we saw a lightning flash from some dark clouds as a storm moved in our direction. Not long after, the wind picked up. Not too much, just enough to whip the trees around a little. We figured that it might rain, but that was no big deal. We just tossed a couple of extra logs in the fire and kept on doing our thing. And then suddenly, and from out of absolutely nowhere, the first hailstone hit like a gunshot. When it landed right in the dirt by Sarah's foot, we saw it was the size of a golf ball. There was like a split second where we were all silently thinking, did that just happen? But then came the next couple, and there was no doubting it anymore. Then the next minute, it was almost like God emptied a giant freezer up there in the sky. Ball-sized chunks of ice slammed down onto us, not little pellets. These things had weight and they actually whistled as they fell. One nailed the cooler and split the plastic on the lid. Another put a hole straight through the roof of the tent. Someone yelled to get under the trees, but they barely helped, and branches cracked overhead as hail ripped through the leaves. We scrambled to cover our heads with whatever we could grab, sleeping bags, backpacks, anything that might provide enough shelter. Sarah screamed when one caught her hand. I heard the crack from 10 feet away, and Scott tried to pull her toward the bigger pines, but a hailstone smacked him in the shoulder and almost dropped him to his knees. Ryan was cursing up a storm, blood already running down his face from a gash on his forehead. I don't remember the one that got me, just the sudden explosion of pain on the side of my head, and then nothing. My lights went out. And when I woke up, the world was spinning. My scalp felt split open and the blood was sticking in my hair and down my neck. My left hand throbbed with 2 fingers already swelling up fat and purple, and the camp looked like some war zone. Tent shredded, gear scattered and battered to hell, and the fire was dead too, just these wet ashes and broken branches. Scott was shaking me, asking me if I was good in a voice that just sounded far away, and Sarah sat nearby crying, holding her broken fingers against her chest. Ryan had a t-shirt wrapped around his head already soaked in blood, and the hail had stopped, but the damage was done. We were all bruised up badly with cuts everywhere, and my head pounded like someone was hammering nails into my skull. Now the hike out was supposed to be just a couple of miles, but it might as well have been 100. We packed everything that wasn't destroyed, but that meant my pack was a hell of a lot lighter than it had been on the way in, but every step still hurt. My vision kept blurring and I kept stopping to lean against the trees while the others waited. Scott's shoulder looked messed up and Sarah couldn't even use her hand, and Ryan kept pressing that shirt to his scalp and muttering that he probably needed stitches. Now we fumbled across the flats in near silence, mostly just heavy breathing and the occasional groan. My brain felt like someone had taken a chunk out of it, and the trees kept moving when they really shouldn't have, and at one point, I thought I saw the trail split in two, but Scott steered me straight and kept me from falling down. We finally got back to where we were parked at around 3 in the morning, and after piling into the truck like the walking wounded we were, we drove straight to the hospital. The doctors poked and prodded and asked me a million questions, and then told me that I had a concussion, some fractured fingers, and lacerations that probably needed stitches. And they kept us for a few hours, pumped us full of painkillers, and then sent us on our way. That was 2 years ago. We still talk about it sometimes, but never like it was fun, and we quit camping completely after that one. Some people say nature is beautiful, and sure, it is. But nature literally almost killed us with goddamn ice bombs one time. And so these days, I'll just take my couch and some YouTube. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All these links are down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. Do you ever find something out that you wish you hadn't? I have, and let me tell you, it ain't pretty. I want to just say first up, even though I know you're not listening, Mom, I don't blame you for telling me this. You did the right thing in telling me, even though I wish that you'd never had to. But good God, I gotta get this off my chest, and I figured sending in a story to the internet anonymously is as good a way as any to do that. And please do keep me anonymous. It all started out around 6 months ago. Well, I guess it started when I was born, but we'll get to that. My mom, God love her, was diagnosed with breast cancer a couple of years ago. She's doing good at the moment, it's in remission, but it led her to think about mortality a lot lately. And I guess word of her diagnosis also go back to my birth father, who I haven't seen since I was 13 months old. And so I get this Facebook message from a profile I'm not friends with, but I know who it is immediately. It was my biological dad, or at least someone pretending to be him. I can recognize him from the name, even though I never took his last name, and from the handful of photos I've seen of him. Now curious, I accepted the message request, even though all Mom would ever say about him was that he was a bad POS and there was no chance that I'd hear from him ever again. Well, I guess she got that wrong, because there I was talking to my dad on Facebook. He was asking about Mom, said that he'd heard about her diagnosis, only 18 months late. Good one, Dad. Now he made some noise suggesting that he was genuinely interested in her health, although I could tell that he wasn't. And then he got to the real purpose of messaging me. Did I want to resume contact with him maybe? Perhaps get to know him? Well, at this point I still didn't exactly know why he was a POS, as she said, just that he supposedly was, and so I told him that I'd need to think about it. I figured if he was genuine, he'd be fine with it. He was, sort of. He said that was okay, and then added, but don't take too long. I think he was trying to imply that he had some health scare going on, and the whole way he talked, it was like those people who love implying mystery and drama and want you to ask about it rather than coming out and saying it. I could already tell that my biological dad was not someone that I would get along well with. I just needed a good reason to tell him no. Naturally, the first person I told that bio-dad had reached out to me was my mom, and the look of horror on her face said it all. At first, all she said is, no, 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 do not talk to that man. But then I told her, as gently as I could, that I needed more. It wasn't that I didn't trust her, not at all. But after all these years, I'd really like to have a reason to tell the man whose DNA I shared to just go kick sand. Mom looked like she was about to argue, and then she kind of deflated and said that, yeah, she guessed that I did have every right to know. And it's not like I was a little boy now. I was a grown man who was about to start a family of his own, and it was probably for the best if I knew why my biological father was just a piece of crap. And so the short version, he was going to kill me when I was just a year old. Now the slightly longer version, because that's not very satisfying, my bio dad was a player. He slept around and never intended to settle down. Mom was young when she hooked up with him, and in her words, it was foolish and naive, and bio dad, being the kind of man that he was, didn't use protection and relied on Mom to take the morning after pill. She did, but it didn't work, and thus I was conceived. My biological father swore that he'd do right by her, and before I was born, they were married. And at first, things seemed like they were going to go just fine. Dad seemed to settle down as a person, and I was born a healthy baby boy, exactly 7 pounds, and an easy delivery. It took 6 months for Dad to go back to his old ways. According to him, he just couldn't help it. He needed more than one woman, but he still wanted to stay married to Mom and be a father to me. She just kind of had to compromise by letting him be the free spirit he was born to be, I suppose. No, obviously, she said no, and after a few months of bio-dad giving monogamy a half-assed try, Mom caught him with another woman yet again and threw him out. The next part, she wouldn't really tell me the details, only that she was forced to stay with her brothers after discovering that Dad had a plan in place to kidnap and kill me as revenge for being thrown out. Supposedly his plan was foolproof, and he'd never even be suspected of the crime. But considering Mom somehow found out, then I imagine he would have been busted within minutes. It scared Mom enough, though, that she took me and hid out with her brothers, who apparently would have beaten him within an inch of his life if he'd come even close to me, and I'm very glad that he never did. As an epilogue, I blocked him on Facebook that same day, and I've never heard from him again. Hey, let's read. First, let me just say you're my favorite creepy story narrator by far. You might recognize me from the comments section, so I won't say exactly who I am, but I comment on quite a few videos, and I always remember thinking, I hope I never have a reason to write into Joel about myself. Well, about 4 months ago, I had a reason, and that reason was someone named Robbie. I work as a barista at a big chain coffee shop, and I've been with the company for a few years, but only started working at the store that I'm at now around 6 months ago. And that's when I met Robbie. Robbie was kind of a stereotype, really, and the type of dude who might make you roll your eyes a bit. He was quite vocally feminist, claimed to dabble with communism, and had a trust fund but worked as a barista to keep himself busy, quote-unquote. However, he was also very flamboyantly campy, and he pulled off the stereotype with a wink and a smile that couldn't help but make you laugh along with him. And within 2 days of knowing him, he was asking me for advice on how he should propose to his boyfriend. He also had the nickname RoboCop, ironically, because he was the least strict shift manager you'd ever meet. I just found a lot to like about him despite certain aspects that would normally not be my kind of person. Now, we worked together for 2 months and became fast friends. Robbie, myself, and a few of the other baristas started going out for drinks together most weekends, and I even joined their little D&D group. I know. Now, I won't bore you by talking about my character. I never thought that I'd be a TTRPG gal, but I could talk about my orc barbarian pole dancer for days. Now, I met Robbie's boyfriend, Dan, and it was pretty clear that the two of them were truly in love. He wasn't there often, but occasionally he'd join us for drinks at our favorite bar, and when he did, he and Robbie couldn't be parted with a crowbar. Now, the only slightly weird thing was how often Dan would refer to Robbie as devilish and one to keep an eye on. Apparently, Robbie would sweep you off your feet in a heartbeat, although I didn't think that I had anything to worry about with, having girl parts and whatnot, and Robbie being very much into the other type. On top of bragging about what an irresistible guy his boyfriend was, Daniel also made it clear that Robbie was supposedly the world's best cook. One night when we were all out for cocktails, he made Robbie promise to invite me over to dinner sometime soon, and I was only too happy to oblige. I assumed it would be one of those things where promises get made and never followed up on, but the next Tuesday at work, on our next shift together, Robbie issued me a dinner invite for that following Saturday. It would be me, him, and Dan, he said. And I said I'd love to, and Robbie told me to make sure that I dressed sexily, and then tipped me a little cheeky grin, showing off his expensively whitened teeth. Again, creepy from some guys, but funny and cute coming from an openly gay guy like Robbie, I thought. I showed up at the given address just after 8 p.m., a little fashionably late, really, but Robbie greeted me with a hug and air kisses and apologized for the absence of Dan. He was a legal secretary and had been called into work last minute to deal with some major client crisis, apparently. However, hopefully he'd show up in time for dessert, which was to be, according to Robbie, a divine pavlova. Robbie took my coat and showed me around the apartment. It wasn't quite what I'd expected. I think I'd been assuming that he lived in this really bougie, fashionable place. Instead, it was kind of messy, like student digs, and he hadn't really tidied up in preparation for my arrival. But why should he, I guess? If this is how he lived, with Bang energy cans lying around and an Xbox on the coffee table, then let your bro flag fly, really. Now he had, however, made a real effort with the dining table. The kitchen, dining, and living room were all open plan, and the area with the dining table looked like it belonged to a different apartment. Curtains down to the floor open onto a balcony showing off the famous skyline of the city that I live in. Candles flickered on a beautifully laid out table. There were 2 place settings at either end of the table. Robbie guided me to that seat facing away from the kitchen and pulled out my chair with a flourish after taking my coat. He told me that the food would be ready in minutes and he just had to grab it from the oven. Now, he also told me to be sure not to look so I didn't spoil the surprise of the menu. I sat at the table and waited, listening to the clattery of dishes behind me. Now, as the impatient person I am, I pulled out my phone and realized that I wasn't getting any coverage in that apartment. I turned in my seat to ask Robbie for the Wi-Fi password, and that's when I saw it. He'd poured 2 glasses of champagne, and it very clearly looked like he was sprinkling something into one of the glasses. Surely not, though. But I know what I saw, and I know the signs, and I know how to be wary, no matter how camp and gay your dinner date might be. When Robbie came back in, he placed one of the glasses in front of me and the other at his place setting. And then the oven timer went off, and I knew it was my chance. If I was wrong, and he hadn't spiked my drink, then no harm done, right? And so with my heart pounding in my chest, I quickly switched the champagne glasses around. It felt like I was doing something you only ever see in movies, but literally in real life. I expected Robbie to appear any second, and if it had been a movie, I would have completed the switch with just milliseconds to spare, but it felt like he didn't return to the table for another 5 minutes at least. When he did, the dish on offer was a decent-looking mac and cheese. Okay, so maybe he and Dan over-exaggerated Robbie's culinary skills a bit. It did look like a good mac and cheese in fairness, and it's hard to get mac and cheese wrong, really. Now, I was a bit wary about eating any of his food, though. If he had spiked my drink, but then he served up his own portion of mac and cheese, and I realized he obviously wasn't going to drug himself. I also found it very amusingly Robbie-like that he served up his own food before offering me mine. It looked like I was going to be helping myself, so I did just that. Robbie kept encouraging me to try the champagne because it was a particularly great one, and so I took a casual sip. He did the same and then took a bigger sip, and he matched me. It was something of a running joke that we had whenever we went out drinking, really, and as we started eating, Robbie was talking about work, and to my dismay, I could hear his words begin to slur. I suggested he drink some more champagne, and he did, and then he drained the whole glass. Now pretty soon, he was displaying all the telltale signs of being roofied. I hadn't been wrong. My heart dropped when I realized how real this was. Robbie had really spiked my drink. Now obviously I know what to look out for with that kind of stuff, and I know what they do, so I knew Robbie would be suggestible, and so I just came straight out and asked him why he'd spiked my drink. He kind of giggled and said that he wanted to try me out. I told him he had a boyfriend and I thought he was gay, and he said that he'd never said that. He liked women every now and then, but it wasn't as fun when we knew about it. Apparently he got off on the surprise, and I felt sick and disgusted. Eventually I got him to admit that he'd roofied at least 4 other people, 3 of which were women, and that Dan knew about it and was kind of a kink to them. If I'd remotely been thinking straight, I would have recorded his confession, although I know now that it wouldn't have done any good. Finally, disgusted and terrified at Robbie's betrayal, I said that I was leaving. Robbie started laughing and saying that he missed me already, and then passed out face first into his plate of mac and cheese. I left him snoring in that sauce and went straight to the nearest police station. When I got done telling the officer everything that happened, I didn't exactly get the answer I wanted to hear. It was my word against Robbie's, and unless he had security cameras inside his apartment and provided the footage to us, then really all we could prove had happened was that I roofied him. The cop, who was clearly sympathetic and felt bad for me, suggested that it was probably in my best interest not to pursue any charges, given how things had played out. Unfortunately, I didn't have the names of any of the other people Robbie admitted to roofing, and really all I could do was hope to hell that this experience had scared him out of trying it again. Now, I'm not entirely sure what he did learn from the experience, though, because I never saw or heard from him again. He just didn't show up to work for the next week. He didn't call in sick or quit. He just pulled a complete vanishing act, and when the other managers tried to call him, his number was no longer in service. I tried to track Dan down, but there was no luck there either. Nobody had seen him at the bar that we hung out at, and apparently he'd never worked at that law firm Robbie had claimed. It was all just completely weird, a very frustrating mystery, and ultimately I'm glad that Robbie is now out of my life, and I have my own theories about why he and Dan both disappeared. I can only hope one of my theories is right, because it would mean Robbie's no longer a danger to anyone. It's deeply frustrating knowing that a potential criminal like that can be out there, but then I have to remind myself that he's just one of many. My heart breaks for his alleged past victims, and while I wish there was more I could do, I'm just very lucky that Robbie's betrayal didn't lead to a far worse outcome for me. I've watched nearly all of your videos, and recently I've been hanging out in your live streams, and from what I can tell, you're a bit of a gamer. And if I recall, you're big into first-person shooters and Fortnite. Now please forgive me if I've gotten that wrong. But the point is, I'm sure you're familiar with and have probably played Halo Combat Evolved. I played through the first game with my friend Kieran when we were just little kids. I was lucky enough to get an Xbox at launch, and then when Halo 2 came out, we played it together in co-op as well. In Halo 3, same story, ODST, co-op with Kieran. Halo Reach, you better believe we played it. And then Halo 4 came out, and it was the start of our senior year. At the beginning of November, I remember it quite well. I'd been dating a girl at the time for about over a year at this point, and tragically her grandmother passed on the weekend of November 3rd. However, we live in California, and the grandmother lived in Rhode Island. My girlfriend only had her father since her mother died young, and I offered to go with her, which would mean leaving on the 5th and staying beyond the funeral, which was the 9th. Basically, I wouldn't be back in California until November 15th. The school was understanding. They gave me work to catch up with while I was away, and my girlfriend was homeschooled, so it really wasn't an issue for her. Everyone understood why I was taking the time out to accompany Jess cross-country to be with her during her beloved grandmother's funeral and wake. And that's everyone except Kieran. I remember telling him just offhand without really thinking about it, and he just went quiet. He frowned and mouthed some things silently to himself, a habit he had when he was working things out. And then he was all, "What about Halo 4? Now, I was a bit taken aback. I said it was fine, we could just play it when I got back, but Kieran was persistent. We played all the other games in co-op at launch. How could we break the streak with 4? I tried pointing out to him that I didn't really have a choice. I explained that my girlfriend's beloved grandmother had literally died and she needed someone with her for the following events. Now, at first I thought Kieran was joking because of how mad he got. But no, he was serious. He was genuinely accusing me of putting Jess before our friendship. And he even used the phrase bros before hoes at one point. And no matter how much I tried to explain to him that this was just a video game and the death of a loved one was a little more important, he wasn't having any of it. Now it ended with him throwing my Xbox 360 pad to the floor and breaking it into pieces and then storming out of my house. I was taken aback. I tried calling and texting him in the 2 weeks before we left for Rhode Island, but he either left me on read or hung up on me. Now, I have no choice but to try and put Kieran to the back of my mind and spend all my time emotionally supporting Jess. It was a beautiful service, and Jess had a huge family. They were all welcoming and made me feel like one of them, and I soon forgot about my lunatic friend, and by the end of the trip, I felt like I'd genuinely known Grandma and genuinely felt a sense of emotion for her. I'd left my car in Jess's driveway, so when we finally returned home, we all said our goodbyes. Exhausted, emotional, and even more convinced that Jess was the one, I drove home. Immediately I could see something was wrong. The front window was smashed in, and the door was covered in a certain piece of phallic graffiti. Inside, the place had been trashed. Just everything had been broken. The TV, my Xbox, my PlayStation 3. Someone had taken a knife to the couch and cut it into pieces. Most of the rest of the room were untouched, and then I went into my bedroom. All my posters had been slashed up. My smaller TV was smashed on the floor, but the worst was the bed. It was covered in both urine and feces and had clearly been that way for a few days. Thankfully, my parents' room was locked. They were away for an extended period of time on some cruise, hence why the house was free to be vandalized. I guess none of the neighbors, who were mostly probably junkies honestly, had thought to alert us or call the cops when they'd seen the broken window or the graffiti junk. I called the cops and then immediately started asking around the neighborhood. Nobody had seen anything, and then finally, I hit upon a stroke of luck. My elderly neighbor across the street had a security camera. Now this was 2012, so they were hardly sophisticated back then, but I was able to see the footage and there was no way of identifying the guy breaking in. He wore a mask and a hoodie. But I knew. I knew the walk, their gait, the slight limp from a skateboard accident, the nervous way he'd dart around. It was obviously my friend Kieran. I told the cops my theory, and of course Kieran had some alibi. Surprisingly, he had other friends and they claimed that he was with them that night. But I knew it was him. We never spoke again, and Jess and I eventually got married and are still happily together today, so I guess it was all worth it. But ultimately, my friend since elementary school was enough of a terrifying psycho to destroy my entire living room, piss all over my bed, and worse, because I couldn't play Halo with him on launch day. Thankfully, my family had home insurance and a lot of costs were covered, but I still had to pay a bunch of money out that I couldn't afford. I stick to single-player games these days or couch co-op with Jess. I think it's easier to understand why. Anytime any of my online buddies ask if I want to game with them, I just tell them that I'm not really into video games, and I've never played Halo since. I'm writing in on behalf of my older parents, who I'm sad to say aren't listeners. They're more of the crime shows on TV type, I'm afraid, and don't really listen to YouTuber channels. That doesn't stop me and my older kids from being huge fans, though, and it's been a long time coming for us to write into you because our family has a long-term, ongoing creepy story about the wildest friends to enemies incident I ever experienced. Now, for some backstory, this all started after I'd finished college and moved into what would turn out to be my forever home with my boyfriend, who became my husband, but sadly hasn't stayed my forever partner since then. And now that myself and my two brothers had moved out of the family home, my parents decided to downsize. They moved into a nice little suburban cottage, and we helped them settle in. One of the first things Mom told me about, with a nice little glow in her voice, was how lovely the elderly neighbors were. They were a couple in their 70s, apparently, who'd been together since high school. They were very fit and active, and in the 2 weeks that my parents had already lived there, they'd become fast friends. The neighbors, who I'll just call Mr. and Mrs. Awful, for good reasons, had made sure Mom and Dad settled into the neighborhood very well. They brought home-baked goods around almost every other day. They'd introduced them to the other neighbors, and it had been nothing but wonderful. Their son worked as the owner of a fresh fish distribution company for the local market, so the family was decently well off. Mom and Dad didn't have a huge amount of friends. They'd both been extremely career-focused until they retired. My brothers and I all agreed that it was great to see them socializing some, and Mr. and Mrs. Awful seemed like the perfect neighbors. What could possibly go wrong? Well, oh my God, the answer is everything. Hate is a strong word, and I don't think I've ever actually hated anyone before, but hand on my heart, I hate Mr. and Mrs. Awful. They seem like such a sweet, lovely couple too, and the first time I met them, it was like I had a new set of grandparents. It all started to go wrong when my parents first went on vacation. They'd been living at the new property for a few months, but this post-retirement vacation was something they'd had booked for years. They probably wouldn't have gone on vacation so soon after moving into a new house, but it was a cruise and a once-in-a-lifetime type thing. Unfortunately, the plan had been for my brother to house sit for them, to look after the cats, and everything fell through. I forget exactly why, something to do with him getting sudden contract work, but it resulted in my parents scrambling trying to find someone to feed the cats during the 2 weeks they were away. I suggested that they ask the Awfuls, and of course, Mom loved that idea. The Awfuls were only too happy to agree to it. They loved our cats, they said, and Mom was pretty stressed out because they're both indoor cats, and she was worried that the Awfuls wouldn't really grasp that. They seemed perfectly understanding of the concept of indoor cats, though, and in fact, they had an old cat until recently who'd lived entirely indoors. They'd make sure that the cats didn't get out and would spend a few hours a day with them even, which was perfect. Now anyway, before going away, my parents installed a couple of small security cameras in a few of the rooms. They weren't going to, but I kind of convinced them. They were worried that it felt like a betrayal to the Awfuls, but I convinced them that it's better to be safe than sorry. And besides, what if someone broke in or the cats did something insane? It's just better to install them and have them hidden but plugged in and connected to a laptop upstairs to record any movement. So my parents get back from vacation, and the cats seemed excited to see them, and so did the Awfuls. Everything seemed like it had gone so perfect, in fact, that my folks didn't even think about checking the security camera footage for a week or so. And in fact, I was the one who checked it when I dropped by for our regular Sunday lunch with the kids and then husband. While the rest of my family were playing some complicated board game that I hated, I decided to go upstairs and just check the laptop to see if my setup had actually worked. But what I saw had left me speechless. The cameras weren't great quality or anything, and they only seemed to start recording occasionally. But what I saw across a few different cameras left me shocked. The Awfuls happily and recklessly just went digging through my parents' things. Talk about nosy. They went through drawers and cupboards, and some days they didn't even show up to feed the cats, and when they did, they were weirdly mean to them, kicking out at them and pushing them away constantly. And at one point, one of the cats escaped. Mr. Awful went running outside after her and came back in with the animal under his arm 5 minutes later. He violently threw her across the room. Thankfully, she jumped onto the couch and landed safely, and I could see him saying something angrily, and the cameras didn't have audio, sadly. I showed all of this to my parents, and they loved their cats as much as they loved their kids. They went storming over to the offals, hammered on their door, and then waited for an answer. When it was answered, my dad just said that they'd watched security footage from their cat sitting week, and that they'd appreciate it if the couple never spoke to or acknowledged them again. If we could leave it there, it would end there. And the elderly Mr. Awful replied with something like, "Your wife was always a C word." Anyway, and slammed the door. We assumed that was it, and it was, for at least a month. And during that time, against my advice, my parents removed the security cameras because they were unsettling. And I strongly suggested that this was a bad idea given that the Awfuls could retaliate, but they're boomers, what do you expect? It really was unfortunate because one day my parents went out for a day trip with a local community center. When they came home, a side window had been slid open. Mom swears that she locked it but can't be sure, and the house itself seemed untouched. No robbery, no vandalism, but it certainly wasn't untouched. No. The house itself absolutely stank like hell itself. I've never smelled anything like it. And at first I prayed that the Awfuls had thrown a load of stink bombs or something around, expired ones based on the smell. But it was worse than that. Every single toilet in the house was filled, and I mean filled, with the most disgusting bowel evacuation you could imagine. None of it was solid, and let me stress here that this was 3 different toilets. Either the culprit had the biggest, most rotten guts of all time, or they'd been saving the produce for this exact moment. But it was strange. They could have thrown it around the house. They could have absolutely destroyed my parents' property with poo, but instead they just filled the toilets with it. Well, it was disgusting, vile really, and it took hours to even begin to get rid of the smell. But we did get rid of the stuff itself by simply flushing the toilets. It just seemed like we were missing something, and looking back now, I can't help but feel that there was an evil genius behind the plan the Awfuls cooked up. 4 days later, the smell came back, only it wasn't quite the same. The parents had been in and out of the house so naturally that they became paranoid that a toilet had been filled again. But no, nothing. In fact, the bathrooms were bizarrely less disgusting than other rooms. The living room was the worst, and then the kitchen, the utility room, and then the hallway, which almost seemed to have a smell which was hidden more than the others. And it just got worse and worse. One night, shortly after my husband had left, in fact to run away with his parents' soulmate, I received a phone call. It was my mom, begging to come stay with me. My home was miserable with the kids missing their dad, and I didn't think my parents joining us would actually be a good idea. I asked why, and she explained that they could no longer tolerate the smell. It was ruining their lives, and they wanted to move out of their perfect bungalow. And I kind of lost it. I said that was it. We were getting to the bottom of this, and we'd already had a guy to check out the drains, so it wasn't that. I knew the smell of dead rats or mice or raccoons, so it wasn't a dead rodent stuck somewhere else. This was almost fishy. And then it struck me. An old prank that one frat had played on a guy back in my college days. They had a fish in his car for a week until it stank really bad, but it was nothing. Nothing compared to this. But I did remember it being similar. And I told my parents to go out for the day and called both my brothers. We went around and searched absolutely everywhere in that bungalow where we might find a dead mackerel or 2. And it was far worse than that. And please, hold on to your stomachs if you're squeamish. 2 rotten octopi, 7 mackerel, over 15 other similar fish, a bunch of crabs and lobsters, a bunch of small, liquefying fish. And the worst was when my brother opened the hatch to the loft and an entire rotting tuna fell onto him. If you've never seen the size of a tuna, Google it. And this thing was, I don't even want to describe it. So we bagged up all the fish, including as much of the liquid rot that we could find, and we took them out to the backyard. And then we did another search, and another. And then we filled the house with air spray and fresheners and all sorts of devices, and then we did another search. And by the time we were confident that we'd gotten everything, it was evening time, and we paid for a hotel for our parents that night, and they returned to their property the next day. Dad didn't even pause to think. He grabbed up the ultra-thick garbage bags of fish and stormed over to the offals. If you recall, their son owned a goddamn fishery. Our theory, which was never confirmed but it was obviously right, is that the toilet incident was a distraction to try and cause us to focus on the plumbing when the smell came back. Then, when we couldn't fix it, my parents would leave. Why had the offals betrayed them? We still had no idea. When Dad knocked on the door, Mr. Offal opened it. Dad didn't even give him a chance to speak, and instead, he was ready and threw the contents of the most foul of the garbage bags all over Mr. Offal and the hallway. He managed to get a second bag too, and then a third that coated their front door. He dumped the remaining 2 bags on their doorstep and left. Now, we all kind of expected a visit from the cops, but there was none. Likely, the Offals had no idea how much proof we had of their guilt. I guess they'd checked for security cameras since they knew it was a safe place for the fish. But who knows what goes on in the head of people like this? Instead, the Offals went on vacation the next day. While they were away, my mom and dad received a letter. It was from Mrs. Offal. I don't have the letter on hand, but I can remember the majority of the insane woman's ramblings. Dear, my mom's name. If you're wondering why it might appear as if we betrayed you, then perhaps ask yourself if you betrayed us first. We've invited you over to dinner so many times, and not once have you commented on any of the new ornaments or home decor we've bought since you first visited. It's rude, ignorant, and insulting. We gave you a small taste of what you made us feel, and then some other ramblings. Now, if you think this story is bizarre, the ending is even more crazy. While the Offals were on vacation, we saw on the local news that a certain fishery had been raided, both for tax fraud and for smuggling cocaine inside shipments of cod. Apparently, the owner's elderly parents, who had owned the business before them, had also been involved in said racket and continued to be involved. And so we didn't even have to go to the cops with that lunatic letter. We didn't have to say a word, we just sat back and watched as their own actions ruined their own lives. I cannot get my head around the reason why career criminals and drug smugglers engaged in such insanely ludicrous revenge. My only theory is, watching the son on television, he seemed like an adult frat boy, and I'm pretty sure all the ideas came from him and his parents went along with them. I've never met a more insane family in my life, and I hope I never do, but I do hope they're having fun in prison, and I really hope they're forced to eat seafood every day, forever. This is kind of a sad story for me to tell, even years later. It just reminds me of the worst of the human condition, and I hate being reminded of that. I do believe humans are inherently good, and have done since I was an adult, but at the time of the story, I kind of thought most people were a-holes, honestly. And this is because of how I'd been treated from kindergarten to middle school. You see, I have a birthmark on my face, and I'll be honest, it's not the easiest one to look at for the average person. It's not one of those skin discoloration birthmarks, but it's a series of lumps and, I don't know, roughness. They look like acne scars, but they're not. They're part of my skin structure. I've had so many tests as a kid to see if it was something worse, but it really is just a facial feature that I was born with, and it covers most half of my face. Now, I've never met anyone else with something similar, at least anywhere near the size that mine is. And yeah, it's still there in my mid-30s. I don't want it removed now. I want people to have to face it, pun intended. Now, even since I can remember from a little kid, I've had people calling me freak and other horrible things when I was out in public. Complete strangers for the most part. They just decided to see a child and tell the child and his parents how repulsive he is and how he shouldn't be allowed out. Now, if you don't think this kind of thing happens, talk to anyone with a very visible deformity and you'll be shocked. I grew up used to it, and I don't want to imply that every person I met or every kid I encountered was a hostile piece of crap, but the fact is, most were perfectly lovely about everything. I had a group of friends in every year. I did notice that that group was shrinking as I got older and kids became more self-conscious and more aware of their own health and mortality, but it is what it is. At the beginning of summer break between grades 7 and 8, we moved to a different house and moved states as well. Part of me dreaded this because it was a whole new group of people to call me freak. At least when you heard it from the same knuckle-draggers every day, it became much easier to ignore. On the other hand, I was excited because my kid sister was excited, and if there was anyone in the world who was the most sympathetic and kind to me about my birthmark, it was her. We'd been moved in for a couple of weeks, and thankfully I was glad to be on summer vacation. Batman the Animated Series had become really big with kids my age, and I just knew that Two-Face was going to be one of the prime insults that I'd have to endure that year. Looking back, being called a crime lord Batman villain wouldn't have been too bad. Unfortunately, they picked Clayface instead, which wasn't quite as cool. I mostly played in the woods behind my house, either alone or occasionally with my sister. She was only 6 and couldn't go too far, play too hard, so I did most of my exploring alone. Now one day I stumbled on a group of 5 kids. Well, it turns out they were the same age as me, about to move up to 8th grade. 2 girls and 3 boys. They were clearly building some treehouse and had been friends for a long time, and I just stood there looking for a while, kind of daydreaming about making friends like these. And then one of the boys, the leader, noticed me, and I braced myself for a torrent of abuse. Instead, he told me to stop being such a weirdo and come hang out. Now, I did see him shoot the others this sort of warning look, like saying, anything in your dead meat, and that was it. And we spent the rest of the day building the treehouse. I was a pretty good architect at that age, having spent a lot of time building huts and tree houses by myself. By the time we all had to go home for dinner, I think we'd actually become pretty good friends. There was this kid named Freddie, he was the leader, and then there was Rob and Phil, who were brothers, and they were the boys, and then there was a very tall girl named Juliet, and oh my god, the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen, and her name was Grace. Now that night, I just stayed awake for hours, staring at some crack in the ceiling, daydreaming about the future friendship that we'd all have. Staring at that crack was one of the most beautiful experiences in my life. I understood then why people lay in bed staring at cracks in the ceilings and why so many ceilings had cracks. It was fate, imperfection, just like me. And then I jerked off and fell asleep. I met up with the gang most days that summer. We had so many amazing memories, riding shopping carts in the Walmart parking lot, drinking Slurpees outside the 7-Eleven, teaching each other martial arts. I was actually a black belt in Taekwondo, so I was able to show the others a few moves. Now, the first big event happened one day when the boys and Juliet had gone somewhere or other, and Grace sat next to me on the wall, on my birthmark side, and shuffled closer to me. I suddenly felt fingertips brushing my cheek and touching the bumps. I realized that was the first time anyone who wasn't a family member or a medical professional had actually touched my birthmark. And then Grace planted a very gentle kiss on my cheek, jumped down off the wall, and sort of skipped off, and she didn't even look back. That night I stared at the crack in the ceiling again, thinking about things, but mostly Grace. And then a spider ran across the ceiling and frightened the crap out of me, ruining the moment. Now, thankfully, I managed to squash it with a Nike shoe that I had and got some sleep. When I arrived at the treehouse the next day, I could hear the others were already up there, earlier than we'd discussed. It was only 3 days until school started, and we were all really nervous about that, or so they said. When I climbed up into the treehouse, I was taken aback by a few things. One, all my friends had nasty, cruel looks on their faces. 2, Grace was sitting extremely close to Freddie and was now holding hands with him. Freddie said something similar to, "Oh, look, it's the freak." And then it all came out. They were tired of pretending, tired of stringing me on. Someone like me didn't deserve to live. I was God's mistake, which, in my opinion, he doesn't make, but they wanted me to feel joy and friendship only to strip it away from me. They paid Grace $10 to kiss me on the cheek and said it was the most vile thing she'd ever done. She told me she had nightmares about it all night. The others chimed in too, with every slur I'd heard before and some new ones added on top of that. Rob actually was the first person to call me Clayface, and oh boy did he make sure that one stuck throughout 8th grade. Freddie and Grace told me that they were going to make my final year of middle school a living hell. They were pretty popular, and if they told everyone that I was some freak, then I guess I just was. They started listing off these rumors they'd planned to spread. I was so ugly the only way that I could get with a girl was to force myself on her. And my parents tried to put me up for adoption every year until I was 10. I was thrown out of 3 schools for being too gross, all sorts of stuff. And then before I could open my mouth and say anything, they told me that if I said a word of this, if I breathed a word of any of the bullying or reported it, then I wouldn't be the only member of my family to have a deformed face. Wouldn't it be interesting if my kid sister had a scar on the other side, they said. I said nothing, and instead they commanded me down from the treehouse, made me strip down to my boxers, and tied me to a nearby tree. And then they left. I didn't say a word, nothing. I didn't even call out for help because I genuinely wanted to just stay there and die. It took over 18 hours and a literal search party to find me. I just said some older guys had done it, some high school or college age, and I never once ratted on my fake friends or the 99% of that 8th grade who followed them in bullying me. I didn't have a much better time in high school. Now, college was better. People were less rude, but my self-hatred grew. And one day, in the dorm room kitchen, I tried to set the birthmark side of my face on fire because at least a burn scar might draw some sympathy. A very kind roommate doused the flames almost immediately. And now, not to be crass, but I make a ridiculous amount of money giving talks on disability and deformity, and I haven't kept track on most of the bullies in my life, but I did keep an eye on Freddie, Rob, Phil, Juliet, and Grace. And the following events happened over the last 30 years. I don't want to say that I believe in karma, but make of this what you will. Freddie eventually became a heroin addict and had to have his arm amputated at the elbow. Rob and Phil were in a car accident. Rob developed a severe permanent limp, and Phil lost an eyeball. Juliet was thrown off her horse as an instructor and actually broke her spine, and she's confined to a wheelchair for life. Nothing ever happened to Grace, though, and I wonder if anything will. I didn't want any of this to happen to any of them, but I can't help finding it interesting that 4 out of the 5 of those people now have permanent disfigurements. Every night I pray to God that it's just some coincidence, that karma isn't real, and that Grace will be saved from any retribution. I forgive everyone who's ever treated me this way, and I still do. Otherwise, the alternative is too scary to think about. I don't think that I'd be Clayface. I don't think that I'd even be Two-Face. Honestly, if it ever came down to it, I'd probably be the Punisher. So this was a strange and absolutely baffling incident of betrayal that I can't get my head round to this day. Just bizarre and strange and terrifying. It all started when the girls at work invited me on a night out. This wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of either. I usually attended. There had never been a problem before. We crawled a few bars and did some karaoke. There were about 5 of us, so we decided to walk to the taxi area down the block. Now, before I even had time to react, a very fit-looking man dressed entirely in black with a balaclava sprinted past me and stole my purse. Well, crap. There goes everything, I guess. Bank cards, phones, mementos, all the crap that you accumulate over the years in there. And when I got home, I was just sobbing and in tears. Now, my hubby, who'd waited up for me, asked what was wrong, and I told him everything, and that I was going to report the theft to the cops. Now, my significant other was a police officer, a uniformed officer, so I expected him to be all for it and offer me a fast track or something. I don't know. But instead, he absolutely adamantly told me that going to the cops was probably a bad idea, and he said that they'd make me feel like crap, they'd make things worse, and they'd try and imply that somehow it was my fault. He said the best thing that we could do is just urgently cancel the cards and the phone and just move on. Now, I wasn't comfortable about this, but like I said, he was a cop himself. Why would he be wrong, really? And so he was incredible after that, super supportive and thoughtful, and he helped me cancel everything and buy me a new bag. In return, I guess I was a lot more affectionate with him, and spent more time with him. We were only in our late 20s, but I'd always had a really low intimacy drive, so I started pushing myself to be more up for it, as they say. He was being such a sweetheart that he deserved a reward, and even started getting me from work every day instead of me insisting that I walked home with the girls. He was always by my side. Months later, I was doing some spring cleaning while hubby was up north visiting his parents, who I didn't really get along with. And so I was going through the guest room, cleaning it out, when I found a black sack with a few items in it. I didn't recognize most of them. They were just small keepsakes, like lockets or a Tamagotchi, a really weird collection. But then I found this old, folded photo in there. A photo of me and my deceased mom on vacation in Florida when I was 15. A photo that had been in my purse when it was snatched because I kept it sealed in a side compartment there. A photo my husband could only have if he had been the purse snatcher. Now, as soon as he got home, I confronted him. I expected him to deny it, but he just didn't. Instead, he asked, "Couldn't I see? Couldn't I see that he'd done a good thing? We were much closer now, emotionally and physically. Our relationship was better." Yeah, thanks to a violent, deceptive betrayal, I thought. And then I asked him about the other items. Now, he stuttered for a moment and then claimed that he had to practice bag snatching a few times to make sure that he got mine right. Sure, buddy, and you had to practice keeping those keepsakes too. I think he snatched more bags after mine and got a taste for it. He told me if I reported him to the cops, he would do some terrible things. Maybe I did the wrong thing here, but I just wanted away from him. I told him that I wouldn't report him to the cops if he agreed to a divorce and promised never to come looking for me. He told me that without me, he might still do some terrible things, maybe to himself, and I said that was up to him. And he collapsed onto the couch and agreed to the divorce. Once the pleasantly simple legal issues were dealt with, I never saw that freak again. I don't know if I did the right thing by not reporting him, but I am convinced that that scared him straight, and I hope I'm right. To my ex-husband, you betrayed me in a way that I can never fully grasp and never forgive. And I hope that keeps you up at night, every night, and that you never find love again. Not that I'm vindictive or anything, but maybe don't have a long relationship and marry me and then mug me in the middle of the night. Then we don't have a problem. So I have a really messed up story about my grandmother, Clarice. So between the ages of 4 and 8, from what we can gather, her mother was poisoning her. My grandma was this sickly child, but back then, medical doctors weren't quite so competent and thorough, and so she was just given some nebulous medicine and was forced to grow up dealing with regular throwing up. She could barely keep food down. She was crazy weak and only attended school once a week, if that. She had some friends who tried their best to make her feel more cheerful. One of her friends, Betsy, dropped by unannounced one day. The front door was slightly open, and so she just kind of walked in because she was that kind of brazen girl. And there she saw great-grandmother preparing some soup over the stove. She dished out a bowl and then reached up into the cupboard for a box, and then using that box, she scattered a tiny amount of powder into the soup. Betsy recognized it right away because her dad had a barn. It was rat poison. Great-grandma was poisoning my poor grandmother. Betsy quickly snuck out of the house before anyone could see her, thank God. She told her parents exactly what she'd seen. Her parents weren't the type to disbelieve their daughter, but apparently the town had been gossiping a little about what was making little Clary sick, and as soon as Betsy described the box of rat poison to her father perfectly, he marched her to the local sheriff's office and passed the conversation over to Betsy. Betsy was a real firecracker, and I am grateful that I got to meet her as an old woman. She's still alive now, although Granny Clarice sadly isn't. And so when Betsy demanded that the sheriff go out to Clarice's place with a few deputies and do a welfare check, well, the story goes that he was too darn scared to say no to this 8-year-old girl. She described exactly where the poison was, and there was no reason for great-grandma to have moved it. The cops burst in. They found the poison, and they found the soup only half eaten. and it was able to be tested, and traces of the rat poison were found. Grandma went to live with her aunt and uncle, who lived on the same street as Betsy, and made a miraculous recovery, or as miraculous as it can be when you're no longer ingesting poison. Grandma loved telling that story, and Betsy still loves telling her part, so I'm sure if you read this out loud and I play that story to Betsy, you'll become her favorite person. But good God, talk about the worst kind of betrayal. I know it's a mental illness, this Munchausen's by proxy, and I'm very sympathetic towards mental health, but this is one that I really, really struggle with. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.